towards the middle of the last century, a typical Belgian family of peasant origin occupied a certain farmhouse in the village of Tremelo, which lies between the towns of Malines and Airshot, some 6 miles from Louvain. A glance at the countryside surrounding the village illustrates, in silent form, the manner of life in which its people generally pass their days. The rich, unbroken plain stretches under a wide expanse of sky. Here and there, from among its silent fields, some of them sheaved with corn, a scattered dwelling upturns its red-tiled roof. The dusty roads, still without undulation, are screened by poplars, with frequent shrines calling from the wayside. Sometimes the low horizon is overshadowed by the outline of a windmill. Wherever the habitations are clustered together, a church tower rises towards the arching clouds. Scarcely a sound, save the mellow cadence of bells, disturbs the air of serenity that broods over the landscape. Life passed in the midst of these surroundings is salted by a tradition of the soil, centuries old. It is expressed by hard, silent labor, going on from day to day with no other recompense than the satisfaction of conscious self-support. Thought and movement come slowly to the inhabitants of these lowland fields. Worldly ambition is practically unknown. The particular farmhouse in the hamlet of Tremelo was, at the time previously mentioned, occupied by François de Besteur and his wife Catherine. Broadly speaking, it would have been difficult to find more fitting representatives of the agricultural stock from which they had descended than this household, which came to include several children. For their working capacity was equaled by a deep, ingrained sense of religion, causing the realization of dependence upon God to well from their natures in a vein of natural richness. Theirs was the pious humility that upholds without over many words or vain display. Expended in a direct manner upon the soil, their lives and spirit were dedicated to God. On January 3rd, 1840, a 6th child was born to them in the little 2-storied farmhouse which, after the manner of the countryside, revealed a plain whitewashed front intersected by wooden shutters. The child was a boy, and the freeholder and his wife experienced some hesitation as to what name he should be given. Only 2 other members of the household will appear again in connection with this story: Pauline, the eldest child, and Auguste, who was 2 years older than the latent arrival. The baby's name was decided by the wish of a family cousin who was asked to stand godfather. "I will do so on one condition." He informed the parents that you call him Joseph, after the head 66 of the Holy Family. This cousin was an old soldier, and he seems to have acquired a subtle understanding of his godchild's developing nature. One of the first incidents in which the young Joseph figured was redolent of a rare quality that promised much for his later manhood. It occurred during his 4th year, at a time when the annual fair was being held in a neighboring village. This festivity, which was usually arranged to concur with the feast of the local patron saint, often lasted for the space of 3 days. And on one of these Joseph disappeared from his home early in the morning and was absent over a period of hours. The distracted parents, hastening to the fair, searched every likely corner of the busy scene. It was Whitsuntide, and the crowd that clattered over the cobbles and loitered in front of the booths displayed all the rustic finery of holiday garb. Every farm, dwelling place, and village in the adjacent district was represented. There were men in smocks, women in black dresses that were relieved by a touch of color at the neck, girls and children in the long dark cloaks that savored of a departing national costume. But Joseph was nowhere to be seen. His godfather, when acquainted with the news, instantly formed a conclusion as to his whereabouts. "I can find him, I understand his ways," he said, forcing a path through the square, without glancing at the stalls and side shows where most of the other children were clustered. Rising from the midst of this motley animation was one silent sanctuary, the village church. Thither the man's steps led him, and having entered, the blare and bustle of the outer streets faded like the symbols of a far distant world. At first, the interior of the building, wrapped in shadows, revealed no sign of life. But with the next glance, 2 things became apparent. The tiny glow of the lamp burning before the altar gave witness to a living presence, while kneeling there, in solitary devotion, was the small figure of Joseph. We can say no more than that a hidden call had inspired the boy to make this act of communion, a call that was to become louder as he grew in years. Apart from his own instinct, the devotional side of his nature was well fostered by the influence he encountered at home. Both parents nurtured a simple, devout love of their faith, and one scene that was frequently enacted in the quiet of the old farmhouse shows the general religious sentiment that permeated every aspect of the D.V. Fuster character. It took place in the large kitchen, where the cheerful glow of firelight played across the red stone floor that was dusted over with sand. Gleams were struck from the various copper articles standing about the room, burnishing the walls that were hung with sacred pictures, while a crucifix and holy water stoup occupied a corner between them. Madame de Vuster, yielding to the persuasion of her children, would put aside household duties for a while to read aloud from a large, well-used volume. It was 2 feet long and 1.5 feet broad, and was entitled The Lives of the Saints. Being the product of a bygone age, it was printed in Old Flemish, scarcely a word of which could be deciphered by the children. But the subject enthralled them. Their favorite stories were those of the ancient hermits, such as Antony, who, by a divine paradox, had striven and achieved much for God in the loneliness of the desert. Again and again, they would pore over the old-fashioned woodcuts that spoke of sublime ideals, patient labor, or heroic martyrdoms, all sustained by virtue of the light of faith. And that they were no idle listeners is proved by their juvenile efforts to put the examples of the reading into practice. It would appear that the greatest impressions were made upon Joseph, Augusta, Pauline, and a cousin named Henri Vincex, who stayed with them. At the time of the following incident, Joseph was 7 years old, and, with the rest of the party, walked each day the 1.5 miles dividing them from school. On one occasion, after a re-perusal of their favorite lives, the appeal of religious solitude was particularly insistent. School was forgotten, and turning aside from the roadway, they went in search of a desert where the isolated round of hermit existence could be enacted, more or less faithfully. The best retreat that offered was a leafy copse, but overlooking the difference between their vernal surroundings and the barren Egyptian fastness where Antony dwelt, the young enthusiasts took possession. Maintaining a rigid silence, they dropped upon their knees and surrendered themselves to prayer and contemplation. They had bidden a last farewell to world and relatives. With noon came the usual feeling of hunger, whereupon satchels were opened and the regular school meal distributed by Pauline, still accompanied by silence. The afternoon lengthened into evening, and still their vows were preserved. But at 9 o'clock a chance passerby happened to catch sight of the young hermits. The news was carried to the farm, from whence a messenger was soon dispatched to interrupt the premature retirement. Not all their youthful contemporaries, however, were cast in the same earnest mold as the de Vuster family. This was especially so in the case of Sus, which name is short for Francis van Baal, a beggar boy who sometimes hovered about the school, throwing envious looks at the dinners carried by the children. The de Vusters' meal seldom differed from the solid fare of bread and butter, but on the day in question this was exchanged for the luxury of cakes. At the close of morning lessons, these were divided among Joseph, Auguste, and Pauline, under the eyes of the indigent Van Baal. He finally sidled up and claimed their attention with a very gratifying remark: "After you had gone to school this morning, I took a young magpie to your house for each of you." Instantly his uncalled-for generosity was repaid by the gift of 4 cakes. But this did not seem lavish enough to Joseph, who exclaimed, "Let us give them all to him. The poor fellow is always in want." So the 3 children's dinners passed into the possession of Van Baal. Yet when they were free to run home, eager to catch a first glimpse of the precious birds, no magpies were to be seen. Neither had Sis Van Baal put in an appearance that day. It so happened that a horse and cart overtook the children on one of their daily walks, and the driver, pulling up, offered them a ride home. They clambered into the cart, and Joseph, who was behind, lost his footing. Slipping into the roadway, fell in front of a wheel, whereupon the horse, startled by the cries of his companions, plunged forward, and the wheel passed not only over the body but also the head of the prostrate child. The only possible thought in the onlookers' minds was that Joseph must be dead, and someone ran to break the news at the farmhouse. His mother arrived in a state of terrible agitation, only to find that apart from a bruised back and a bump on the head, Joseph was none the worse for his accident. "We cannot say it was a miracle," said his brother, speaking of the affair later, "but we gratefully acknowledged a merciful intervention of divine providence." Many signs of Joseph's intense religious fervor were always forthcoming, but much more remarkable was the early way in which he developed an understanding of mortification, which, even to the adult world at large, is one of the most unpopular virtues. In the case of Joseph de Vuster, we are now able to recognize it as an essential feature in the development of a martyr, but those who came in contact with the boy's efforts in the midst of his home comforts experienced, of necessity, a feeling of righteous resentment. He conveyed a plank into the bedroom which he shared with Augusta, and by carefully hiding it during the daytime, no one suspected its presence. One moonlit night, however, his brother woke and saw Joseph sleeping on the plank which he had placed over the top of his bed. Augusta tried to persuade the youthful penitent to abandon this habit, but was finally won over to give a promise not to inform their mother. Joseph continued this manner of sleeping for some time, but at last there came a morning when some fit of unwanted hurry caused him to forget the plank, which was left in its telltale position over the bed. It thus met the horrified eyes of his mother, who caused it to be removed. One is tempted to wonder, in the face of this natural evidence of maternal solicitude, what her thoughts would have been. Could she have divined a single aspect of the future that Providence had ordained for her son? The boy's development left no doubt as to the reality of his religious instinct. He always seemed to be somewhat apart from his companions, not by his own choosing, but rather because he sensed a higher guidance, of which they were unaware. His was no ordinary standard. The usual childish values made little or no impression upon his character. But these words must not be taken to mean that he was in any way unnatural. It is true that he was extremely sensitive and shrank from a word of reproof. Also, he never took part in the more boisterous recreations of his kind, although this withdrawal owed nothing to timidity. One of his most predominant traits, which endured far beyond childhood, was a happy disposition. The smile of Joseph de Veuster could achieve much, and might have marked him for success in the round of social existence. However, it was destined to serve him in the wider sphere of heroism, where spiritual endurance was called for to meet conditions as terrible as any that ever man has faced. His partial aloofness was decided by a strain of serious thought. While still very young, he would often detach himself from his immediate surroundings and spend hours in solitary contemplation. Much of his time was passed in the fields, where he soon acquired an easy popularity with the shepherds. He often walked in the wake of the flocks as they went to pasture, while the attention he gave to the lambs earned him the name of the Little Shepherd. Moreover, he was also distinguished from the usual run of schoolboys by his great eagerness to learn. As a pupil of the small village school, at Werchter few opportunities came his way, but the inclination remained and increased with his physical development. From this school he wrote his first letter. It was addressed to his parents and dated December 31st, 1848. The wording, which is not that of a child of 8, points to the assumption that it was either copied or dictated by an instructor. Love and gratitude urge me to come and beg that you will accept the prayers I offer without ceasing to the author of all good. This year, you can be sure, will be a happy one for you, if God deigns to hear them. May this expression of the feelings of my heart, poor though it is, make the offering of my good wishes acceptable to you. Your son, J. de Veuster. In addition to the circumstances of birth, it soon became clear that Joseph was fitted for agricultural work by a hardy, robust constitution. He showed great aptitude for the active occupations that fell to his boyhood on the farm. A vigorous and conscientious worker, in spite of his youth, he dug, planted, and performed various manual duties without sign of fatigue. Earnestness marked his work from the very beginning. No task was ever neglected or set aside unfinished, and although skillfulness of hand was added to his bodily strength, the boy's heart, intent upon knowledge, can never truly have been in the labor he carried out. But he was always mindful of the service he owed his parents, and was quite prepared to subjugate his natural promptings to the interest of the farm. Again, it can easily be imagined that to one of his ardent religious temperament, these duties were accepted as another form of the mortification he so desired. Throughout life, he exemplified the saintly precept of subjecting his own mind and body, and this in the full consciousness of natural vigor and an intellectual urge to higher studies. Joseph's love of animals, which had been evidenced during his walks over the fields, was further shown by a happening that illustrates his zeal for the welfare of every living thing. On his way to school, he passed the cottage of a widow, whose sole means of supporting herself and family was but one cow. The fact of depending upon an animal for existence may sound strange to our commercialized hearing, but it is no rare thing among a peasant population. In the course of his passing to and fro, Joseph heard that this cow was dying, which he well knew meant that the widow's very livelihood was threatened. He called to see the despairing woman, and found the butcher almost in the act of putting an end to the suffering of her prized animal. At Joseph's entreaty, this was postponed until morning. Meanwhile, he asked to be allowed to remain in the cowshed through the coming night. The only light during this strange vigil came from a single lantern. We cannot follow the boy as he sat in the half-gloom of a dismal shed in the presence of a sick animal. Imagination may even furnish a touch of the mystical. But with morning came the definite certainty that the cow was well on the road to recovery, whilst all trace of the illness disappeared soon after. It has been said that Joseph never took part in the rough games of other children. However, he excelled at skating, and when the waterways round about Tremilou were frozen, as they sometimes were for months on end, he had no equal in the village. He made practical use of his ability on the ice by running errands for people who otherwise would be handicapped by the weather. For many a mile he sped over the gleaming flats, swift as the sharp. I wind that accompanied him by the broad, lowland acres, now silent under a heavy mantle of snow. And only broken by the white outline of trees that stood in soft relief against the powdery background of sky. Once, while speeding over the surface of the frozen river dial in this fashion, he came to the spot where its waters, under normal conditions, would encounter those of the lac. Suddenly, he was aware of a sheer drop opening beneath his feet. The surprise was so great that a desperate swerve barely saved him from being precipitated into the depths below. But he regained his composure and then turned to examine the site where he had come near to death. He had shot to the brink of the abyss and just skirted its extreme edge by his swift, sideway effort. And there and then, in the midst of those silent, wintry surroundings, he gave thanks to God. The scene was impressed upon his memory, causing him to experience again and again the sudden recoil and first feeling of horror. Even before the termination of his elementary studies, Joseph's parents had recognized that he would be wasted at agriculture, and by dint of hard saving they were able to send him to college at Braine-le-Comte, in the province of Hainault. The object behind this was to fit him for a commercial occupation, since there he would gain acquaintance with the French language. Belgium, as regards speech and certain characteristics, contains two practically distinct types of people. In the south they are known as Walloons, and share many ties in common with their French neighbors, whose tongue they speak. The northern Flemings have decided points of contact with the Dutch, while their native language is Flemish. It was to this latter type that the de Vuster family belonged. Joseph's brother, Auguste, was already intended for the church. So far there was no thought of the younger boy following his footsteps. The giving of Auguste was looked upon as sufficient sacrifice for a household whose existence was linked to the soil, and Joseph was therefore entrusted with the gleaning of more worldly laurels. His masters soon noticed this and did their best to restrain him. But it was not easy to check the boy once he had directed his mind to any definite goal. He tried to mingle study with his leisure and recreation, while he took long walks for the purpose of debating problems no less than for exercise. At one time it seemed that these habits, which made great calls upon his strength, would undermine his health. But Joseph's constitution, derived from generations of contact with the sun and the soil, stood him in good stead. Perhaps the greatest hardship he encountered was the separation from his home. For the ties of a well-ordered family are not easily broken, although Joseph found consolation in the fact that he was now on the high road to knowledge. In writing to his parents, he said, "It is with great pleasure that I take up my pen, to write you a short letter for the first time. Bye. Now I am quite accustomed to this place. I talk to the Walloons a little. I know my work, my lessons, my companions, and my bed. Everything in the house is very clean and comfortable. Our table is something like the one at an annual fair, and the beer is very good. Any Walloon that laughs at me, I hit with a ruler. Our master is a Walloon, he is. Very good and learned. He gives me lessons. In the first day I was a little shy, and I didn't 66 like to ask for anything, though I had neither books, pens, paper, or anything I wanted. Afterwards I asked M. Dern, our master, for some books, a brush, pens, and some copybooks. On Sunday we went for a walk. I walked with a Walloon and asked the name of everything I saw. On Whit Monday we went to the fair at Soignies with 5 Flemings and saw a beautiful procession. It is quite evident that for some time Joseph had no other thought than the following of his intended career. He was filled with a deep sense of gratitude towards his parents for the careful plans they had made to ensure his future. And in view of the unexpected break that came between him and their designs, it is well to be reminded of the following sentiments, which, being expressed by Joseph, reveal some of the poignancy of the future sacrifice. It is to you, my dear parents, that I owe not only my present happiness, but also the education which I am receiving and which will be useful to me all my life. I do not know how I can ever prove, as I ought, my gratitude to you for all the benefits you have conferred upon me from my earliest years." He never neglected to inquire about all the members of his household and showed the anxious solicitude of a serious boy as regards their health. In 1858, a mission was held at the church of Braine-le-Comte by the Redemptorist fathers, and Joseph, who was then in his 18th year, attended. The young student's pious nature was deeply affected by the services, the waves of fervor sweeping over the great assembly, the resolutions that were born again in the heart of every listener, the words of the sermons which, on all such occasions, are charged with redoubled solemnity. The names of those particular preachers are unknown, but it was no uncertain grain they sowed on those forgotten evenings at Braine-le-Comte. For when the mission closed, a new martyr was potentially on his way to stagger the world. Joseph de Vuster would have revealed his inborn religious faculty under any conditions. It had always been part of his very being, whether at home or school. But his devotion was even more intense after the mission, as those about him instantly observed. Joseph, remarked one of his school fellows, came home from the mission evidently struck by something that had been said, for instead of retiring to rest, he used to stay up a good part of the night praying earnestly to God. So it was that his parents' scheme, lovingly fostered by the calm of their fireside, was superseded by a greater plan. To Joseph, the revelation brought the profound conviction that God had destined him, from the very beginning, for his service. All the devout sensations he had experienced through life were but preparations for this now visible end. He had received a divine call to enter religion, and every other consideration must be put aside. Although conscious that he could never look back, Joseph nurtured his early resolves in secret. He knew that prolonged prayer was necessary to clear away any suspicion of doubt, and spent long hours in reflection. With the flooding of his soul by the thought that he had received a divine commission, he was assured of one thing, namely, that he could not accept a business occupation. Hitherto he had lived as a good Catholic, naturally not exempt from the usual faults of infancy and boyhood. There had never been a thought of his becoming a priest. No such idea was inspired in Joseph when Auguste had realized his vocation. The surprise and sudden downfall of their hopes would make it doubly difficult for Joseph to enlighten his parents, especially when one remembers his supersensitive nature. Auguste, who had taken the name Pamphile on entering religion, was an ecclesiastical student of the Society of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary at Louvain. And whilst Joseph was still debating in his own mind, news came that his sister Pauline had also taken the religious habit and entered a convent. This increased the difficulty of declaring his intention, but nevertheless it provided an excuse for broaching the subject. He accordingly wrote home on July 17, 1858. "I am very glad, my dear parents, to receive the parcel you sent me, and also a letter from Pauline. You sent the very clothes I wanted. I was more anxious to read the letter than to look at the clothes. She told me she had left you on June the 8th. What a happiness for her. She has had the happiness of fulfilling the most difficult task on earth. I hope my turn will come to choose the path I ought to tread. Will it be impossible for me to follow my brother Pamphile?" This letter, in which the query was all too palpable, doubtless came as something of a shock to his parents. It hinted of another breaking away from their already diminished household. We cannot tell what reply was forthcoming, but in the meantime Joseph was making his own plans. His first thought was to become a monk of the order of Reformed Cistercians, or Trappists. Their austere mode of living appealed to his well-developed sense of mortification. While he was yet undecided, he had a meeting with Pamphile and discussed the probability of embracing a strict rule. His brother explained the details of the society to which he belonged, and in the end Joseph gave up the idea of being a Trappist in favor of becoming a priest of the Sacred Hearts. This congregation had been founded by Father Coudrin in the Rue Pipus, Paris, on which account its members were commonly known as the Pipus Fathers. Under its full title of the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary and of the Perpetual Adoration of the Most Holy Sacrament of the Altar, it had been approved by Pope Pius VII in 1817, again by Leo XII in 1825, and finally by Gregory XVI in 1840. The principal aim of its establishment was to reproduce the 4 stages of our Lord's life. By educating children and training young men for the priesthood, it imitated his infancy. His hidden life was to be expressed by the exercises of the adoration, his public life by preaching and missionary enterprise. Lastly, his crucified life was to be followed as far as possible by works of Christian mortification. Once the nature of his religious calling had been decided, Joseph no longer hesitated but went forward with his ambition. We are ignorant of the next advances he made to his home, but judging by the letter he wrote on Christmas Day, 1858, they would seem to have been unmistakably direct. It contained the following sentences: "I cannot hesitate to write to you on this grand Christmas day. for this great feast has brought the certainty that God has called me to quit the world and embrace the religious state. Therefore, my dear parents, I ask you again for your consent, for without it I cannot venture to enter on this career. God's commandment to obey our parents does not apply only to childhood. Do not think that in choosing the religious state I am guided only by my own will. I assure you that I do but follow the will of divine providence. I am not afraid that you will refuse me, since it is God who calls, and I am obliged to obey his call. For you to hinder your child from following God's will would expose yourselves to terrible consequences from his anger, and would expose me to the irreparable misfortune of losing the vocation for which God has destined me from infancy, and would put in jeopardy my eternal salvation. You know, my dear parents, that each individual is bound to conform himself to the designs of God in choosing a state of life. If he wishes to make his future happiness secure, do not, therefore, distress yourselves at God's designs for me. Augusta writes me that I should certainly be admitted in his congregation as choir brother, that I should not fail to speak to the superior at the new year, and should begin my novitiate a little later. Hoping for this great happiness, I sign myself your obedient son, Joseph de Veuster. The clear light of reality shone through this simple, considerate, yet firm appeal, and Joseph's parents, by reason of their spiritual outlook, recognized it. They knew their son was no mere enthusiast, while his persistency dispelled all doubt as to the genuineness of his vocation. So they consented. Joseph was free to join the service of God at the altar. Early in 1859, he was presented with the chance of satisfying his heart's desire. His father was summoned to Louvain on business, and Joseph accompanied him there for the purpose of seeing Pamphile. The brothers dined together, and over the meal Joseph persuaded Pamphile to approach his superior with the view of letting him remain in the convent. In granting this wish, the superior must have been favorably impressed by Joseph. It is likely that a glance showed him the unerring faith illuminating the young man's countenance. At any rate, it was decided that Joseph's future home was to be with the Pipus fathers. And when his parent returned in the evening, expecting they would travel back together, it was to be met by the news that he could only say farewell to his son Francois de Veuster, who had anticipated this moment for months past, now accepted it as the undoubted will of God. Joseph accompanied him to the station, explaining that this manner would dispense with the sadness of a formal parting, after which the farmer returned to the quiet fields surrounding his homestead at Tremolou, while Joseph prepared to follow the further ordering of his call. The happiness he felt at realizing his cherished project can be imagined rather than described. It was the answer to a prayer which had been first in his heart, since the thoughts of a religious future had dawned upon him. But now the vigil was ended, and the silence of long night watches had yielded the vision splendid. His joy communicated itself to others, and the Father Superior was soon convinced that he had made no mistake in admitting Joseph to the congregation. From the very earliest moment he lived in the community as though already accustomed to its rules. And looking back upon the young man's behavior, at a later date, the Superior described his early impression in these terms. To witness his very deportment, the great joy which, tempered with calmness and serenity, pictured the happiness and peace of his soul, was to call to mind the words of Saint Aloysius uttered on entering the cell of his novitiate, "Find my repose in this house, here will I live, because it is the house of my choice." Joseph was always distinguished by a frank, open bearing. He was also very direct in speech and manner, while his bodily vigor was equalled by a strength of personality. His physical powers were to stand him in good stead hereafter, together with the practical turn of mind he inherited from his Flemish stock, which made him a capable organizer. Before his actual entry to the religious state, Joseph spent a few weeks at home. Of all the old scenes that returned to his memory, surely the most outstanding was that of his mother, reading aloud the stories of the saints to her assembled children. Of these, one daughter had passed into a convent, a son was training for the priesthood, while another was shortly to leave them forever, also at the bidding of the sacred profession. But the continual sacrifices evoked no feeling of regret in their parents, whose hard-working lives were illumined by the consolation of faith. Joseph's last evening at home was spent by the fireside, sitting in the midst of the remainder of his family, while the October mist closed down over the outer fields where he would soon become a stranger. They discussed the future, the possibilities of his high calling, and when morning came, he turned from the old farmhouse with the sound of their chorused well-wishing in his ears. He encountered many a friendly farewell as he passed through the village, and so, With the serene confidence that comes of divine service, he went back to Louvain. The date of his entry to religion was October as the world judges. It was a far cry from the hamlet of Tremelo to the old Brabant capital, Louvain. For over 1,000 years it has reflected the luster of learning, in quest of which many a famous personage has walked its streets. But the name of none can be invested with a more heroic significance than Joseph de Veuster, who surrendered manhood, then life itself, to perpetuate the glory of God. One of the first things required of Joseph in his new life was to adopt a name by which he would continue to be known in religion. His choice lighted upon Damien, after the physician saint who, with his brother Cosmas, was martyred in the year 303. No name could have been more appropriate for him in the course he was destined to follow. As he afterwards said of the people who became his charges like my patron saint, "Damien, I try, with the help of God, to alleviate their bodily pains and so bring them on in the way of salvation." Damien, as he must now be called, was not sufficiently educated to become a candidate for the priesthood at once. For one thing, he had no knowledge of Latin, therefore he had to be content with the position of lay brother. In this capacity, on October 8, 860, he took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a brother of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, in which society he was pledged to remain. His duties were humble and laborious, and of a menial nature. But Damien had been well equipped for them by his early life on the farm. He worked with his usual thoroughness and care for details, fired by the knowledge that he had taken the first step towards his ideal. The thought of becoming a priest was never absent from his mind, and during his daily tasks he formed the habit of gleaning every scrap of knowledge that was likely to prove of value. Moreover, Pamphile was of great assistance in the matter of Latin. This was not the outcome of any regular tuition, such as might have been arranged by the brothers. But while Damien was busy at his work, Pamphile started reading to him from a Latin grammar. Damien soon acquired an elementary understanding, after which Pamphile instructed him in words and phrases. The young aspirant so applied himself to the study that before 6 months had passed, he could translate any passage of Cornelius Nepos with ease. Noticing this, his superiors took special interest in Damien, and before long he was admitted to the ranks of those training for the priesthood. He then went to Issy, near Paris, for his novitiate. However profound his sense of dedication might be, he still retained his youthful high spirits and interests, which, if anything, are accentuated by the constant awareness of God at Paris. He said, "We live happy and peaceful. I study Latin and Greek from every morning till evening. Every Wednesday we have a walk. Today, I believe we are going skating. I must ask Gerard to lend me his skates, because they don't know how to skate here." News reached him about this time of his grandmother's death, and Damien, who was always sensitive where ties of relationship were concerned, changed color as he read the letter. It was only by making an effort that he could keep his place in the refectory. On April 25, 1861, Damien recorded the following experiences in a letter to his parents. "Of course you are anxious to hear how things are going on in Paris. Unfortunately, as I never read the papers, I am not well up in the state of affairs. It is very seldom I go out in the town. Every Wednesday we go for a walk in the wood at some distance. About this wood I could say a great deal, as I know every avenue in it. About 1,000 men are always at work there, in order to make it more pleasant. But unfortunately, whereas before one could be quiet and enjoy the pleasures of a walk, now we see nothing but gentlemen and ladies, riders and carriages at every turn, which are a great distraction and very annoying. What walks there are in the town have now no attraction for me, as they had at the outset. To my mind, there is something very melancholy about them. So whenever there is any question of a choice as to our walks, I always leave the streets to those who are more curious than myself. In our community, everything is going on splendidly. We are all as active as hares and get ting on capitally with one another. The arrival of one of our missionary bishops has given us an occasion of having Pontifical Massachusetts in our chapel. It was on Easter Sunday. It was the first time I had seen this solemn ceremonial. Instead of 2 or 3 priests, 20 or 25 were at the altar. In the evening after Vespers, the chapel was full of soldiers. The good bishop held a short discourse, gave them his blessing, and then came benediction. The soldiers sang, served at the altar. In fact, they did everything. They themselves were delighted. I believe this zealous missioner will shortly return to his mission in Oceanica, and may possibly take some of us with him. Would you not be happy if I were to be one? Damien, in fact, gave many evidences of a decided bent for missionary work. This was seen by his father superior, who encouraged it by making carefully chosen references, such as to the state of St. Paul's mind while he was at Athens. In course of time his novitiate at Paris was completed, after which he went back to Louvain for theological and philosophical studies. He was once again under the same Rufus Pamphile, who was able to observe the enthusiasm with which Damien fulfilled not only religious duties but any opportunity for service that came his way. For instance, during the building of a new chapel, the younger clerics assisted the workmen. But the clearing of the site was impeded by the presence of a chimney, very tall and tottering, which had to be demolished. And none of the workmen would venture upon the risky task. Damien, after quietly taking in the position, procured a ladder. This he placed against the chimney, and while someone steadied the ladder from below, he mounted it and cleared away the rickety obstacle, brick by brick. "Mon Dieu!" exclaimed the astonished laborers, "what a man!" His desire for self-mortification was still intense. The superior of the house had forbidden any rigid practices, but one night Pamphile, who shared a room with Damien, woke suddenly. On glancing towards Damien's bed, he must have been reminded of a similar scene, and under the same conditions, at Tremolo, for the bed was unoccupied, Damien having wrapped himself in a blanket and gone to sleep on the bare boards. It required all Pamphile's firmness to make his brother conform to more ordinary habits, for Damien seized every chance of treating himself with severity and was careful to hide such means from his companions. As a student, he sat down to the second dinner, and it not infrequently happened that the supply of meat by that time was getting short. Without a word, Damien would pass his share to someone else in whom the spirit of denial was less strong, so that his principal meal often consisted of soup and potatoes. This again caused Pamphile to remonstrate with him, although it would seem but little effect was produced, for his eagerness to overcome hardship was a providential preparation for the great test of endurance that came later. These mortifying endeavors were not the outcome of ordinary desire, but the workings of a soul fitting itself for sublime accomplishment. Naturally, Damien was unconscious of any such end at the time. He could but follow the allotted path and accept, even without understanding, the evidences of divine wisdom that met him on the way. Moreover, he was influenced by the knowledge of his bodily strength, which seemed an added reason for enforcing its subjection. The customary trials and hardships of religious life never disturbed him. If anything, he thought them personally insufficient, and apart from regular prayers and devotions, he spent many hours of night alone in silent worship. Instead of first joining with the brethren for matins and meditation at 4:30 in the morning, Damien would enter the chapel at 3 a.m. Again, it frequently happened that the Pipes congregation made a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady of Montaillou, which was not far from Damien's home but some distance from Louvain. It was necessary to leave the house at midnight in order to reach the shrine for early mass on the following morning, and the community made up for this by retiring to rest very early prior to departing. But Damien, on all such occasions, never took any rest. He passed the intervening hours on his knees, and when the time came to start would be as fresh and ready as the others, showing no sign of fatigue. It was doubtless these hours of secret contemplation that determined his character and fitted him for the spiritual heights that saw the performance of his life work. The activity he displayed in a physical sense was equaled by his zeal for the welfare of souls. Soon after returning from Paris, he approached his father on the subject of taking communion more often. François de Veuster was a devoted follower of the faith and frequented the sacraments 4 times a year. Then, it is true, this counted for much more than would be the case at present. But Damien was not satisfied and gained his point after a little tactful persuasion. When the time came for Father Pamphile to celebrate his first Mass, Damien had another aim to accomplish. 10 relatives, including their parents, uncles, sisters-in-law, and a brother-in-law, had promised to attend this truly momentous occasion in Pamphile's life. And it was Damien's wish that every one of the visitors should take the scapular before leaving. It was quite possible that some would object, but Damien prepared the necessary number. Another priest, Father Wenceslas, who knew the members of his family, was told of Damien's intention, and the whole company met in a room when Pamphile had said Mass. At a suitable moment, Damien produced the scapulars, which he asked Father Wenceslas to bless and then put on those who were present. He described them as souvenirs that Pamphile was pleased to offer all who had shared in the festival. And not one objection was made, every head bowing in acquiescence as the priest approached. It was a triumph of tact for Damien, on which account he was complimented by Pamphile. Damien shared the proper feeling of humility that commonly distinguishes the great. It is a fact that in learning he never rose above the normal level of a priest, and he once told his brother, when I assist at the lectures of the university, the sight of so many clever fellows makes me veritably ashamed. His care for details never slackened, while everything he did was characterized by the same earnestness. On one occasion, during training, the instructor laid special emphasis upon the points of silence, recollection, and prayer. It was not enough for Damien to consign these to memory. Taking a knife, he cut the 3 words on the top of his desk, where they were always visibly before him. He could never tolerate the criticism of superiors in religion. Equally strong was his aversion to any sign of disagreement among the members of the community. Chancing upon 2 brothers who were holding a somewhat heated argument, he exclaimed, "Are these the children of the Sacred Hearts?" and turned his back. However, apart from his great energy and perseverance, Damien was hardly distinguished from the other ecclesiastical students. In time, it was thought, his forceful character would carry him to a responsible position. But of his real future there was no promise, for his preparation was concerned with the hidden things of the soul. It would seem that more than a whisper of the nature of his life work had come to him. Already he felt the hard wood of the cross he was to carry into a far land, and with it had come the assurance that the way would be long and tedious. Such an undertaking called for the giving up of all earthly and personal considerations. He was to spend himself in charity, exhaust his vigor, and strain the utmost resources of his soul. Hence he applied himself to the encouragement that comes of mystic isolation with God. Long periods of solitary prayer confirmed his resolution and fitted him for the great loneliness that was to form part of his career. For during his aftermath of tortured days, that spirit of contemplation was to prove one of the secret sources of his endurance. Like every other sublime occurrence, the act of martyrdom is no sudden growth. It is not born of a hasty conclusion, but is rather the outcome of a prolonged dedicatory habit. That hour of triumph proclaims the natural end towards which a soul has passed through a period of generous resignation. And Damien, unseen by the world, prepared such a mystic flowering upon an inner soil. The call, whenever it came, would find him ready to venture beyond the outer gateway, disciplined, tenacious, and in the white armor of perfect faith. He progressed in religious life. Damien's ideal, which was to be sent on a foreign mission, became more fixed. He took as model the great apostle of the East, Saint Francis Xavier, and prayed to be allowed to imitate his virtues. Damien felt the same all-conquering zeal to minister to the souls who were separated from Christ. And he now applied himself, with the ardor that had previously led him into the priesthood, to the preparation for a missionary existence. He explained this to his superiors and constantly begged St. Francis to intercede for him that his aim might be realized. In the domestic chapel at Louvain there was a certain window before which hung a blind. Various scenes were pictured upon this, among them being a representation of that particular saint. It became customary for Damien to kneel before this picture at a given hour, praying for help and guidance. Judging by all that lay ahead, there can be no doubt but that these prayers were answered. For if ever a servant of God followed a definite call throughout life, that servant was Father Damien. As an instance of his enduring affection for home ties, he wrote on December 29, 1861, "My dear parents, I am delighted to see the time come round again when so many good wishes are sent up to the throne of the Most High for the welfare of parents and friends. I hasten to give you some proof of the love and gratitude of which my heart is full. In wishing you a happy new year, I pray heaven to shower down on you its blessings in abundance, to grant you good health joined with a peace of soul which nothing can disturb, to fill you with such love and charity that, after God, all your care shall be to love one another and make peace and union reign among the members of the family, and to give you great success in your temporal affairs, but above all in the affairs of your eternal salvation." It has already been said that one of the main objects underlying the foundation of the Society of the Sacred Hearts was the preaching of the gospel to heathen. In view of this, Pope Leo XII had placed the Sandwich Islands under the care of the Papist Fathers in 1825. Various missions were accordingly dispatched there from time to time, and Damien naturally looked forward to the day when he would be permitted to join them. The unexpected change in his life from that position of lay brother to that of church student may be attributed to the working of a divine plan. This might also be observed of the manner in which he at last entered the ranks of missioners. For in 1863, the year of his sailing, he was still in minor orders, and so far unlikely to be engaged on the serious work of his institute. By that time, however, his brother Pampal had been ordained and was under orders to hold himself in readiness for an early departure to the South Seas. The most that Damien could hope for was to join him there before long. but the guiding hand of Providence was about to intervene. Pamphile, of course, also looked forward to completely realizing his vocation in the mission field. What were thought to be his last days in Louvain passed joyfully, although shortly before sailing time an epidemic of typhus broke out in the city. As a priest, he was called upon to visit the sick, providing for their spiritual wants. He therefore lived in daily contact with the infection, which at first he seemed destined to escape. But before the end of his brave ministry, he fell a victim to the disease. His condition was made worse by the knowledge that he would be unable to sail with the mission, thus adding a cloud of melancholy to the usual effects of the illness. The society had also paid his passage to the Sandwich Isles, and these dismal thoughts recurred to his fevered mind again and again, each time marking an increase in the anguish of his stricken body. In this state he was visited by Damien, who had been silently forming a decision. This was now revealed, in his customary direct manner, by the question, "Would it console you if I went in your place?" A light came into Pamphile's eyes as he gave the hoped-for answer, "Yes." Both brothers experienced a sudden thrill of satisfaction, and it was remarked that the invalid's recovery set in from that moment. As for Damien, he surrendered himself to the project with all the eagerness of a boy. To guard against a possible refusal, he neglected to inform his superiors of the resolve. Neither did he ask any advice, but wrote at once to the superior general in Paris. He outlined the position and offered himself as a substitute for Father Pamphile. The intervening days were full of anxiety for Damien, while under the surface, they involved the framing of a great decision on behalf of the church. But shortly afterwards, while the students were seated in the refectory for dinner, the superior entered holding a letter. He threw this towards Damien, saying as he did so, "It is rather foolish of you to want to go before you are a priest." There was a trace of annoyance in his voice, for Damien's action, while not specifically wrong, did not savor of absolute obedience. Such a thing is by no means rare in the lives of the heroes of Christendom. It is not that they disregard earthly form, but rather the following of a divine dictate that supersedes every other consideration, the enforced directing of natural means to achieve a supernatural end which, for the time being, is hidden from human reason. Damien, after reading the contents of the letter, was unable to restrain his joyousness. He ran into his brother's bedroom and waved the letter excitedly, repeating, "Yes, I am to go instead of you." As an ecclesiastical student of 23, he was not far removed from the natural high-spiritedness of youth. But even this was eclipsed by the surge of indescribable gratification which, as promised by Christ, comes to those who give up all for his service. By his willingness to abandon the things of life, Damien knew that he was about to rediscover them in greater measure. The letter also instructed him to join his fellow missionaries in Paris, where, as a spiritual preparation for the voyage, a retreat was to be held for those who were about to embark. This left Damien very little time in which to say farewell. So, without so much as returning to the refectory, he at once set off for home. It is such hours as those that ensued between Damien and his family, the last they would ever spend together in this life, that provide instances of the consolation of faith. For in those days the facilities of modern travel were unknown, thus giving an air of permanency to any separation by long distance. Damien and his parents were fully conscious of this, while he was linked to his Flemish home and its surroundings by many. But there was no desperate leave-taking, no entreaty, no personal persuasion. He was parting from them in obedience to God, whose love had bound them together in everlasting bonds that transcend space and time. The same divine bounty would continue to overshadow them, however scattered. Land and sea may divide, but they would still be partakers of the same sacrifice. They would meet in prayer, in the same aspirations of the Spirit to its one source. Damien, it would seem, wished to strengthen the faithful resignation of his mother by referring her to a sublime example. He asked her to meet him on the following morning, at the shrine of Our Lady at Montaigu, that their final words might be exchanged under the sheltering care of the Blessed Virgin. She also had taken farewell of her son and watched him depart on a journey that, as he well knew, was to be his last. And Damien had it in mind to pray that the balm of comfort might be granted to his mother from the depths of that other woman's heart, 7 times wounded. They met, in the bleak grayness of an early October morning, at the appointed place. Few words passed between them. Before leaving, Damien raised his hand, pointing, in a gesture of dedication that included his parent, to the Mother of Sorrows. Then he asked her to intercede with our Lord on his behalf, that he might be given 12 years of life for the performance of his ministry. This prayer was more than granted. He was to illumine the coasts of darkness for 25 years. On the way back from the pilgrimage, he appeared to be troubled. It was something apart from the normal sadness of separation that weighed upon him, and when asked the reason, he said, "I was overcome at the thought of never seeing Our Lady of Montaigu again." Within a few hours, he had rejoined the community at Louvain, after which he set out for Paris. The missionaries were to embark from the German port of Bremerhaven. While in Paris, Damien had his photograph taken. He sent a copy of this to his parents, with a letter in which he asked them to say a rosary every evening for the missioners. The portrait shows a strong masculine face, broad forehead, and eyes set in a firm, steady glance. It was the face of a mediator made direct by the consciousness of truth. He had lately become rather short-sighted, which caused him to wear spectacles. In a cassock, and with one hand clasping a crucifix, he stood forth as a typical missionary. His Flemish countenance radiated a simple earnestness, the evidence of a true vocation, which promised to make light of every obstacle. For 3 days, Damien and his companions remained in retreat at the mother house in Paris. At the end of that time, on a Thursday, they took train at 9 o'clock in the morning and traveled without a stop till noon on the following day. The little company was in the charge of 5 fathers, who had journeyed with them from Paris. On reaching the port, their sailing vessel was ready to start. They went aboard at once, and the luggage was packed in their berths, Damien estimating that the clothing supply was sufficient for 3 years at least. The cabins were small and contained 2 bunks placed one above the other. In spite of the changed surroundings, their discipline was not relaxed in any way. The rules were observed with the same regularity as at Louvain, certain hours being set aside for prayers and study, while recreation was taken in the saloon, which was used as a refectory. A party of nuns had traveled to Bremerhaven on the same train as the Pipa's fathers. The Reverend Mother who had accompanied these passed through Louvain on her way back to Paris, and while there met Father Pamphile. Their conversation turned on Damien, whose behavior had so impressed the Reverend Mother that she told Pamphile, "Your brother is a saint, Saint Aloysius. No one can see him serve Mass without being struck by his extreme devotion." It will be remembered that the same resemblance had occurred to the superior when Damien first joined the community at Louvain. He also had recognized the quality of the spiritual fire flowing in the breast of this boyish Belgian peasant as that which had illumined the young Italian nobleman centuries since. For sanctity, irrespective of place and time, produces its own parallels. It may perhaps be likened to an earthly forecast of the communion of saints: one master, one burden, one reward. On the eve of sailing, when the first breath of excitement had died down, Damien made a mental survey of his position. He was about to leave parents, sisters, and brothers, and those he called his second family, namely, his friends in the Society of the Sacred Hearts. Moreover, the continent of Europe was to be exchanged for uncivilized, if not brutal, surroundings. The sacrifice is great indeed, he reflected, for one who tenderly loves his parents, his family, his brethren, and the land of his birth. But the voice that is called upon us to make a generous sacrifice of all is the voice of God himself. It is our Savior who says to us as to his first apostles, "Go, teach all nations, instructing them to observe all my commandments, and behold, I am with you all days till the consummation of the world." Damien had already received a presage of the divine assurance that bids a man dare greatly for the sake of God, sometimes to the amazement of the world. For, conscious of having turned his back upon the common values of mankind, he went on to say, "These last words of our Savior are very consoling to us. Jesus Christ is in an especial manner with missionaries. It is he who directs all their steps, who preserves them from all danger. It is he who commands the winds to cease, and the sea to be calm, the wild beasts to depart from us. And our spiritual enemies, the devil, the world, and the flesh, to leave us in peace. It is he who in the midst of trials, contradictions, and sufferings will cause us to enjoy a happiness of which he who has never experienced it can form no idea." Reading these words, we become conscious of the same spirit in which a handful of humble Galileans had once set out to conquer the pagan world, which had enabled countless early Christians to meet death in the arena for a Roman holiday, and inspired the saints through many a weary hour in their great task of battling with all-powerful problems. Bereft of visible aid, they had reposed upon the promises of Jesus Christ, and, judging by their results, it would be well for the world, in this age of conflict, to reflect on what they knew to be the mainspring of their actions. Here Damien further, "For the graces of our state are so powerful that the greatest difficulties and trials do not trouble us, they were bound to accomplish that which an irreligious man has never attempted. Moreover, apart from higher duties, the divine assistance was manifest in what seemed to be the most irrelevant details. We already feel this, he added, for when about to launch out in the midst of a stormy ocean, not only are we free from fear, this the sailors are, but we are as merry as can be. After being half an hour together, we are often quite tired with laughing and telling funny stories. Saint Francis of Assisi and his companions were called by the name of troubadours, the troubadours of God, since their labors served to exalt the poetry of nature underlying religion. A similar innovation was worked in the legend by the figure known as Our Lady's Tumbler, who capered before an image of the Blessed Virgin. They equally provide instances of the mystical madness for such it seems to the eye of flesh which, of all species of inspiration, is the most lofty and inexplicable. Damien and his friends were subject to the same spiritual ruling. Their lives, whatever the issue, were pledged to the service of God. Hence they could afford to be merry without reason, secure in the knowledge that their course would be shaped according to divine wisdom. The last words of Damien before he finally set sail were as follows: "Farewell, dear parents, farewell. Be careful always to lead a good Christian life, and never let the slightest willful sin stain your soul. Walk in the right way. This is the last thing I ask of you, promise it me, and I shall be without fear on your behalf. I shall look forward with confidence to seeing you again in the heavenly country. Again, farewell. May heaven bless your declining years. May the Blessed Virgin grant you the grace of a holy death, which will be followed by a happy eternity. This will be my daily prayer. Farewell. With heartfelt love, your affectionate son, Joseph de Vuster." On November 1st, 1863, the vessel bearing the missionaries sailed from port under a fresh wind. Damien had looked his last on Europe. Months of laborious sailing were occupied by the journey. Rough seas ran most of the way, while off Cape Horn a terrific storm broke over the vessel. This lasted for some days, during which, tossed by high winds and exposed to savage currents, the boat nearly foundered. The missionaries were reminded of the danger of their situation by floating spars and other signs of wreckage that swept by on the heaving water. Damien and his friends commenced a novena to the Blessed Virgin, which came to an end on February 2nd, the Feast of the Purification, 1864. The storm ceased almost at the same time, and the vessel passed safely out of the straits in calm water. Another rough spell was encountered in mid-Pacific, which caused Damien, with a touch of humor, to write to his brother that the ocean, being the reverse of Pacific, had been misnamed. While at sea, Damien acted as sacristan. It was therefore part of his work to attend the altar, which was specially prepared for the voyage. At one time the supply of altar breads was exhausted, and Damien experimented with flour, which was all the material at hand, until he could produce them. He also gave expression to his early training in manual work by helping the sailors during his scanty leisure. At last, having weathered the storms, they came to anchor in the harbor of Honolulu, the capital of the Sandwich Islands, on March 19, 1864. It was the feast of Damien's patron saint, Joseph. The scene of their landing must have offered a strange contrast to northern eyes. The mountains and lesser hillsides, crowded with the manifold colors of tropical growths, the waves, blue as the overhanging sky, dashing themselves to foam against the reefs of coral, and the natives, flower-crowned and with garlands in their hands, who lined the shore in readiness to greet them. It was a vivid, smiling landscape, and one that seemed to promise, at first glance, a perfect setting for the eternal message, to proclaim which the little band of missionaries had come so far. But at the time of our story, it had barely emerged from the darkness of pagan worship. The Sandwich, or Hawaiian Islands, as they are sometimes called after Hawaii, the largest of the group, were discovered by Captain Cook in 1778. They were ruled by the brutal caste system, which made a number of trifling occurrences punishable by death. For instance, it was a capital offense for a man to let his shadow fall upon the chief for a woman to eat with her husband, or to touch any of the things offered to idols, such as pork, fowl, coconut, or bananas. Certain times, such as when a new temple had been completed, were made the occasion of human sacrifices. Children were frequently put to death, maniacs were stoned, while the aged were buried alive or left to die unattended. A partial form of Christianity, preached by American missionaries, had reached the islands in 1820. While 6 years later the first party of Pius fathers sailed from France as a result of the charge given by Pope Leo XII. The native king was favorable to the new arrivals, and a definite improvement soon occurred in the island order. But for some time idolatry was still practiced, and was only overcome by a native chieftainess after her reception of Christianity. In places, remnants of these old superstitious cults were not far below the surface, so that it was no easy task awaiting Damien on his first ministry. He described Hawaii, his earliest station, as being as large as Belgium. If not larger, 3 volcanoes stood in the center of the island, and one of these, called Keelania, was active. It was in the district of this volcano that his work lay, and since eruptions were frequent, the ground he walked was entirely covered by lava. The first act of the missionaries on landing was to repair to Honolulu Cathedral, where Mass was offered in thanksgiving for a safe journey. And now, before he could take an active part in converting the natives, it was necessary for Damien to be ordained. In company with 2 others who were in minor orders, Fathers Levain and Clement, for in France the title of father is given to ecclesiastical students, he was sent to the island college. There he remained for 2 months, completing his final studies and preparing for the great act that would admit him into the priesthood. This took place on the Ember Saturday in Whitsun Week, 1864, in Honolulu Cathedral. The ordination was performed by the bishop, Monsignor Maigret, who, while remaining Damien's superior, was to become his friend. But the day following marked an equally important event in Damien's life, for it was then that he celebrated his first Mass. Standing before the altar, at that remote spot in the South Seas, he made the body of Christ. It was the fulfillment of a promise given to God during the long night watches he had kept, long since, in Belgium, when he prayed for the grace to serve his Maker, body and soul. No words can measure the deep feeling of spiritual awe that overcame Damien as he offered up the holy sacrifice. And apart from this, he was struck by a new sentiment when he came to reflect upon the nature of his congregation. He administered the sacrament to about 100 people, many of whom had been lately steeped in the darkness of heathen rites. Now they had come together in the name of the one true God, and his were the priestly hands which had consecrated the mystical offering that will ever be the center of divine service. The Belgian priest, in the heart of the Pacific Ocean, and surrounded by natives, was giving witness to the universal truth. One of the first things he learnt was that the English language was in common use among the islanders. With the thoroughness that always distinguished him, he at once added it to his studies, and later on spoke it habitually. Early in June, he and Father Clement were ordered to Hawaii. They left on the same steamer as their bishop, and next morning came to the island of Maui. A new church had recently been erected there, in which Damien said Mass. It was scarcely ended before he heard the sound of the steamer's whistle, calling him aboard. Once again at sea, they hoped to reach Hawaii on the following day, but when a little way out, the steamer caught fire, which caused them to put back into harbor. Part of their intention was to arrive at their destination before the feast of SSS, Peter and Paul, for the blessing of a new church which had been built by lay brothers. The coming of another vessel was therefore eagerly awaited. At the end of a fortnight, Damien was sent to a part of Maui some 15 miles distant. He there exercised the duties of his sacred ministry, preaching and hearing confessions in the native language. This was his first independent task in the chosen field of apostolic labor. He returned at once to the house of the fathers at Maui to find that his companions had already crossed in a schooner. There was nothing for Damien but to wait until the steamer had been repaired, so that he landed at the Hawaiian port 5 days after the bishop and other fathers had left. Even then, his destination was found to be on the other side of the island. The father in charge of the place where Damien landed offered to accompany him to Father Clement's mission, about 90 miles distant. They were only able to ride part of this tedious way, and covered the rest on foot. But on arriving, they were deeply gratified by the warmth of their welcome. The former priest of the place had died 4 years earlier, and since then the faithful had been without the blessing of sacraments. Damien, being new to a priest's work, was especially struck by their reception. He felt the wish to stay and continue his ministry among these people, but duty beckoned further afield. On July 20th, he obtained the services of a guide and next day started for his own district on foot. For 3.5 days they continued walking and completed the first stage of their journey on the 24th. There Damien again encountered his bishop and 2 more priests, Fathers Charles and Celestine, whom he had come to assist. The bishop soon returned to Honolulu, while on the 28th Damien finally arrived at his mission. It was named Puna and occupied the territory midway between the districts of his 2 fellow priests. He estimated that it would take him 3 days to traverse it from end to end. 8 villages were scattered within its borders, and among these the work of conversion was barely started. It was more than 7 years since a priest had resided there regularly, while the district was also without a church. 2, however, were in course of construction, and in the meantime Father Damien either traveled with a portable altar or said Mass in a native hut. The news of his arrival created something of a sensation and awoke a new interest in religion. He commenced his missionary efforts at once, and on his first round baptized 29 persons, while several others were prepared. It was, of course, a necessary part of his work to study the character of the inhabitants, whom he described in these terms: gentle, pleasant, mannered, exceedingly tender-hearted. They neither seek to amass riches or live in luxury, or dress much, but are most hospitable, and ready to deprive themselves even of necessities in order to supply your every want, if you have to ask a night's shelter of them. If Providence were to send us a holy priest, like the Cure d'Air as he reflected, these stray sheep would soon be gathered, and Damien would have recoiled from the suggestion that such a need was about to be realized, and in his own person. For beyond the call to enter the priesthood, he was quite unaware of his high destiny in religion. It is the intellectual, artistic, or active pursuit that gives a man some knowledge of an exalted future, if such be ordained. But it would appear that God, in forwarding his more direct designs, proceeds by other methods. The divine seed is sown in a hidden manner. The spiritual strength is renewed in quiet moments of isolation, when the heart is filled with a natural humility. No thought of power or conquest except over evil can enter in. So it was with Father Damien. By joining the South Sea mission, he had, as the world judges, resigned the prospects of any great advancement in the church. But those who work in fellowship with God are not dependent upon material values. And without knowing it, Damien, in his island retreat, was to surround his name with a lustre that one day would irradiate the world. He was only 24 and already in charge of a separate parish. But to a strong sense of responsibility, he added the vigorous enthusiasm of youth, while he was specially suited for missionary enterprise by his unfailing physical strength. His daily activities presented a striking contrast to the lax, easygoing temperament of the natives, who at first watched him pass from duty to duty with a vague feeling of wonder. On this account they likened him to a fire or tempest. Then his personal force compelled them to imitate him in a number of ways, so that gradually the native character was shaped to a more useful and resistant mold. After acquainting himself with the needs of his parish, Damien wrote to his brother in Belgium for a supply of rosaries. He also asked him to buy 2 bells for the new churches that were nearing completion. In time, the material labor and foresight that Damien expended among his charges would only be equaled by the effects of his spiritual ministry. By quickly adapting himself to the strange conditions and showing a sympathetic understanding, Father Damien soon won the confidence of his flock. But never for a moment did he overlook the essential dignity and responsibilities of the Christian position. For instance, he was always most careful in the matter of administering holy baptism. Damien was well aware of the perhaps fatal influence that a bad Catholic would exert over the rest of the community. This has always been so in Europe, and is still more apparent in surroundings that, nominally speaking, are not Christian. So he delayed baptism until the catechumen was in a proper state to be entrusted with the gift of the faith. It therefore became his duty to elevate them to that necessary and humble frame of mind. Wandering in the midst of that picturesque country, he encountered nature in all her adverse and changing moods. Sometimes he turned aside from the path of evangelism to reflect upon the beauty of the scene in which he labored. And the God he preached in the Gospels would be manifest, and the fruits of his creation on every side. Mountains, clothed in vivid green, met the startling blue of the sea. On gazing at the clear water, a number of brilliant flecks betrayed the presence of fishes, moving among the white clusters of coral. The bare grandeur of rocks was broken, here and there, by a sparkling waterfall. Masses of flowering shrubs and trees intermingled. In panoramic display with the winding groves, a feast of color, variety, and perfume, especially to one accustomed, as Damien was, to the long, unyielding symmetry of Flemish fields. The following account conveys a graphic impression of Damien's surroundings. It is a description of the active volcano that stood in the heart of his district, and was written by Edward Clifford, an English artist who, as will be mentioned, visited the father during his last months of life. Writing of the crater, which he described as being round and about 300 feet in diameter, he said its rim is about 10 feet high and is full of boiling lava. The lava is as liquid as thick soup and of a bluish-gray color, with occasional greenish tints. It keeps simmering and heaving, and then it breaks in all directions into most lovely vermilion cracks, changing into violet and then into dead gray. Nearly all round the edge it shows scarlet, and tosses up waves which are not unlike the waves of the sea. Only they are red hot, and the spray is the color of coral or of blood. Above them is often a beautiful lilac or violet effect. This violet atmosphere of the fire is one of the loveliest of the phenomena. Sometimes the edge of the volcano gets undermined with its fiery waves and topples over with a crash, and all the time a roaring sound goes on like the roaring of the sea. And now, as one watches, one suddenly sees a scarlet fountain begin to play in the middle of the lake. At first it is about 2 feet high, with golden spray, then it gets wilder and larger and more tumultuous. Tossing itself up into the air with a beautiful kind of sportiveness, great twistings of fiery liquid are springing high into the air, like serpents and griffins. My last view of the volcano was at night, when its color was nearly that of a primrose. Enormous waves and fountains of fire were playing and tossing up wreaths of spray, which sometimes fell almost at my feet, and lay like red-hot snakes till they cooled into pitchiness. It was such conditions as these, working upon Damien's mind, that tended to increase the distance dividing him from home. Time and again he recalled, in fancy, the little village, his parents whom he would never see again, the quiet domestic scenes, and religious reminders that had first encouraged his sense of devotion. But what had his thoughts been when, in the glow of early enthusiasm, he had turned his face towards the new existence he was now leading? They were bent upon the fulfillment of a pledge, uttered long since but, being divine, not subject to time or place. Amen. I say to you, there is no man who hath left house, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or children, or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who shall not receive 100 times as much, now in this time houses and brethren, and sisters, and mothers and children, and lands, with persecutions, and in the world to come life everlasting. This had called from him the joyous expression of confidence Jesus Christ is in an especial manner with missionaries, and never once did the assurance fail him. His sense of constant communion with God and the blissful satisfaction it brings knew no dimness. The stress of missionary life made letter writing but a rare luxury, so that Damien, in every sense of the term, was cut off from familiar associations. But whenever possible, he breathed his strong spirit of filial affection into letters, and always showed interest in the details of everyday existence. Moreover, his written words revealed the great peace that was filling his soul. As he informed his parents in March 1865, "It is a great happiness to me whenever I have an opportunity of sending you news of myself, of reminding you, my dear parents, that in the midst of the great Pacific, on an island about 150 leagues in circumference, you have a son who loves you, a priest who prays for you, a missionary who passes his time seeking the lost sheep of our adorable Savior. I have plenty of cares and troubles here. Still, I am very happy. Or some months Damien continued his hard, often disappointing life, in the parish of Puna. Apart from priestly duties, he was constantly called upon to battle with the most trying natural conditions. Illness was rife among the natives, while many were still sunk in idolatry and superstition. In every sphere of activity he was faced with trials and difficulties, as part of his daily portion as God's messenger. There were long, weary hours of tramping through the dense forests, exhausting rides under the tropical sun, stiff climbs to be made over the rocky hillsides that divided the villages of his district. But Damien, in addition to performing these tasks in true missionary spirit, offered thanks for all the hardships he endured. With the example of the Passion constantly in mind, he knew that the victory of light over darkness would not easily be accomplished. Yet the measure of his success was dependent upon the fierceness of the struggle. He saw, in every aspect of the opposition he encountered, a promise of ultimate triumph, in which the iron of resistance would be transformed, by divine sanction, into the gold of gain. For such is the keynote of our Christian philosophy. He was soon given a chance of revealing his essentially generous nature. While traveling, he came in contact with the priest who had charge of the parish of Kohala. This parish adjoined his own, than which it was far more extensive. And the father who tended this wide tract, which Damien described as being as large as the whole diocese of Malines, was getting old and yielding to the prolonged strain of tropical existence. Damien observed this, and requested his bishop to allow them to change parishes. This was done early in 1865, so that the young priest was now entrusted with a district that he could hardly cover in less than 30 days. For this purpose he bought a horse, costing him 100 francs, and a mule, for which he gave 75. Whenever his place of call was on the coast, Damien traveled by boat, He quickly established himself in the favor of his new charges, who were always pleased to see him coming. And it was at Kohala that Damien commenced his practical ministry, for which he was to be noted throughout the islands. There were 7 churches in his new parish, and Damien decided that this number should be increased. He thereupon took up this task in the direct manner which had characterized Saint Francis of Assisi, this is, by building them himself. It was now that he experienced the benefits of his early training in manual work, which together with his strong bodily frame and tireless energy, enabled him to perform feats that astonished the islanders. In the words of his bishop, the natives are in constant wonder at it. They think it a miracle when they see Father Damien carrying a beam of wood up the hill all by himself, which 3 or 4 of them together could scarcely lift. Damien started by fitting up his churches in the usual manner, complete with benches. But the natives, being totally unaccustomed to such furniture, could not be persuaded to use them. Only mats were used for seating accommodation in their huts, where chairs and tables were unknown. So Damien dispensed with regular seats in favor of mats, which, he admitted, were more economical. The bells he had asked his brother to send from Belgium were delayed, and in the meantime Damien called his congregation together by sounding a horn. One of these wooden churches he constructed cost about 4,000 francs. Damien expended his last coin in this, and was left 400 francs in debt. He decorated the churches to the best of his restricted ability. The sisters who worked on the island made artificial flowers, while Damien molded tapers from the produce of his beehives. From time to time, you see, I allow myself the luxury of a little honey, he remarked in mentioning this. As the number of churches grew under his hands, another priest arrived to take over half the district. This left Father Damien with 3 churches to serve. They were about 15 miles distant from each other, and he said Mass at each in turn on Sundays. Apart from the villages, there were many scattered habitations, which made it impossible for every Catholic to attend the obligatory services. Damien therefore took advantage of the best alternative that could be arranged. He chose a number of suitable young men from among the natives, on account of their earnestness and devotion. These he taught the epistles and gospels of the different Sundays as they occurred, and then dispatched them to the more isolated settlements. When the people had gathered, Damien's chosen followers recited the epistle and the gospel, and led them in prayer. By these means, those who were debarred from attending the offering of the holy sacrifice could, at least, follow the ministration of their shepherd in spirit. Moreover, the faith was kept alive in many a part where it might otherwise have languished. Damien found that the population of the islands was gradually decreasing, as more died yearly than were born. Several of the generally accepted customs called for his intervention, such as the problem of native dress. On weekdays, the islanders were practically half-clothed, but as the result of his influence, a much better standard was observed on Sundays, when they were quite well dressed. The friendly relationship that existed between priest and parishioner was founded upon a deep sense of charity on the one side, and on the other, a feeling of reverence and respect. Speaking of the natives he encountered, Father Damien said, "I like them immensely, and would willingly give my life for them, like our divine Lord. So I do not spare myself, when it is a question of going to visit the sick or any other person 7 or 8 leagues distant." Various incidents may be related, each typical of the hazardous conditions under which he worked, but nothing ever cooled his missionary ardor. To again quote his words, "I am myself exposed here to many dangers of body and soul. But knowing that I can do nothing of my own strength, I put all my confidence in our Lord, who has accepted my service, and nourishes me daily with his body and blood in the holy sacrifice." He thus declared his readiness to die for those whose spiritual welfare was in his keeping, and proclaimed his utter dependence upon the sacramental aid that has its being in the words, "This is my body." Later events were to bear out, in heroic manner, the sincerity of his first statement, while as regards the second, the Holy Eucharist was destined to prove his support, amid conditions of indescribable horror. Let us take one example of fortitude from among the many that made up his daily life. He happened to be riding one day through part of his district, when he heard news of a remote Catholic settlement where the priest had died without, as yet, a successor being appointed. The thought at once struck him that there were people, somewhere within reach, who were being denied the consolations of the faith. Without further consideration, he asked the direction of the settlement, and his informer pointed beyond the lofty mountain at whose foot they were standing. It took Damien a moment to tether his horse, after which he began to climb the formidable height. The incline was very steep, but by careful footwork and clutching the tufts of vegetation that grew on the side, he at last reached the summit. Once there, however, he could see no trace of the settlement. He was on the verge of a precipitous valley, and faced by another mountain no less forbidding than the one he had already scaled. Again he applied himself to the task of climbing, but not with his first vitality. He at last came to the top, spent yet relieved at the thought of what he had accomplished. However, on casting a look round, the same absence of human habitation met his eyes. Before him stretched an expanse of open country, and beyond that, a third rocky slope. He crossed the plain, then took a steady glance at the further mountain he would have to pass. It towered perilously above him. He was thoroughly exhausted and bleeding from hands and feet, but he had no thought of giving up the venture. The spirit of Damien the priest was supreme over the tired body of Damien the man. He braced himself for the ascent, saying as he did so, "Courage, Joseph. The good God also has shed his blood for those souls yonder." And so he began the third climb, leaving a trail of blood on the rocks he clung to for support, and with his boots by that time torn to shreds. But having gained the summit, he saw the reward of his efforts. There, on the immediate landscape, nestled the settlement. He at once made himself known to the natives, who, having been denied the sacraments for so long, greeted him with every expression of gratitude. The warmth of their reception, and the pleasure he felt at exercising his ministry among them, more than repaid Father Damien for his strenuous exertions. Such things, however, were but one of the many ordinary burdens of missionary life, and he accepted them as a means of gratifying his desire for mortification. It must always be borne in mind that Damien, in addition to his spiritual office, was intensely practical. The whole story of civilization shows that there is more than a casual connection between these two issues. Only error detaches the saint, the mystic, and the dedicated priest from the vital affairs of the world. In fact, many of the things we accept as natural to existence have first been shaped within the Catholic enclosure. It is only the passing or superficial that boasts of a purely earthly origin. Damien must never be visualized as having been a man solely intent upon converting the natives. He knew that conversion, in the true sense of the word, implies a new outlook, a change of life, and he moved among the natives as the giver of both these things by virtue of the grace of God. In their natural no less than spiritual sphere, he came to fill a position of authority. The conditions of life on the island presented him with ample opportunities. He carried out every priestly function, which also meant fighting against the prevailing evils, and the volcanic nature of the country caused many disasters that called for his intervention as priest and helper. There were earthquakes and hurricanes that totally destroyed the lightly built settlements. On one occasion, an earthquake killed 30 people, while 40 more were lost in a tidal wave. Damien's travels frequently led him across the sea. This was a risky procedure, as his only transport was a hollowed-out tree trunk, controlled by young natives. To guard against possible accidents, Damien always secured his baggage by straps and made an act of contrition before stepping aboard. One day, crossing to another coast, they encountered a high wave and were thrown into the sea. While swimming, they could not right the canoe, but managed to guide it to safety. Damien's only loss was a small breviary, which was ruined another time he was riding along the shore when he sighted a small boat, drifting, yet with passengers aboard. He at once waded into the sea and brought the boat to land. It contained 4 Englishmen, 3 Americans, and a Dutchman, the survivors of a vessel which had taken fire 8 days previously. They were all in the last stage of exhaustion, and without the timely aid of Damien could only have drifted onward to a terrible end. In the midst of his various occupations, Damien's thoughts often reverted to his little home in Belgium. On October 12, 1869, he wrote to his parents, "For a long time I have been distressed and in suspense about you, not knowing what might have happened. I learned to my great joy that you are in good health." And some time later he said, "My mother's letter, which reached me in January 1870, brought me the good news that, thanks be to God, all my family are very happy." The following words, read strangely from Damien's pen, placed as he was in sea-girt, flower-crowned Hawaii: "I am sorry to hear that war has broken out between France and Prussia. I hope Belgium at least will not be disturbed." A touch of the earlier, light-hearted spirit which had characterized the boy Damien occurred in a letter he sent to his sister Pauline, who was a nun at Uden, in Holland. "3 years now, and not a line from you," he wrote. "Where are you then, my dear sister? Are you off to heaven already? Not so fast, if you please. A little more time is needed to win that crown. Take pity then on your poor brother, who by dint of being so long forgotten, will soon become a regular savage among savages. Well, I certainly love my savages, who will soon be more civilized than Europeans. They all know how to read and write, and are quite well dressed on Sundays. He deplored the fact that in visiting the sick, which was his chief daily task, he often came in contact with the native doctors. Then it would be a struggle between their influence and that of the priest, as the word doctor was generally another term for sorcerer. These people preserved the old pagan notion that every disease derived from some mysterious cause, so that in many cases of affliction they still offered idolatrous sacrifices. It is very hard to disabuse these poor people of such superstitious ideas, added Damien. Still, by preaching and watching over them, especially when sick, I have hopes that a good many of my flock die in good dispositions. They are always glad to receive the last sacraments. Another passage reveals a mood that must frequently have clouded the mind of Damien the missionary when he reflected upon his labor and its sometimes disappointing result. But even then, his ever-glowing faith causes it to conclude upon a note of triumphant resignation. In general, I have much bother and little consolation, and it is only by God's grace that I find my yoke sweet and my burden light. When I get a little unwell, I congratulate myself that the end is near, but I am content with my lot. Only let perseverance crown my work. Let us be in the hands of God as tools in the hands of a skillful workman. Whether in life or death, we belong to Jesus. By a divine paradox, the success for which Damien craved was to result from the coming of a terrible calamity. For his zeal and endurance were about to be tested by an ordeal as searching as any in the records of suffering humanity. Long ago, as a child listening to the doings of saintly adventurers and martyrs, whose names shine in letters of gold across the world, he had formed definite ideals. But was he prepared to observe them in following the later course of his life? Or were they no more than empty imaginings? Would he, too, by an act of sacrifice and devotion, become an everlasting example to those who seek to live by the spiritual, rather than the earthly nature of man? God knew. But in the eyes of mankind, the young Belgian was about to be called to give an account of his resolution. In what appears to be his last letter written from Kohala, for he was soon to leave that parish, he mentioned the following ominous fact: leprosy is beginning to be very prevalent here. There are many men covered with it. It does not cause death at once, but it is very rarely cured. The disease is very dangerous because it is highly contagious. The laughing, carefree beauty of the Hawaiian Islands had suddenly revealed a hidden taint. They were to undergo a period of tragic despair, during which many of the victims would cease to think of God in connection with their universe. How reconcile the thoughts of divine love with the abject misfortune that was apparent on every side? Far easier to live again the old, irresponsible life, without thinking of tomorrow, still less of eternity. But a single hand, that of Damien, was to part the shadows and answer the challenge of God by raising the cup of sorrow to his ready lips. The scourge of leprosy has been made familiar to us all by means of numerous biblical references. It would seem that our Lord showed a special pity for lepers, which illustrates another contrast between his divine law and the old Jewish dispensation. For according to the latter, leprosy was a sign that the victim had sinned greatly in the sight of God. Everyone afflicted with the disease was therefore an outcast, in a moral, no less than physical sense. He was unfit for human association. It was not only that the rest of mankind ceased to regard him as a citizen, but in the eyes of his fellows the leper was counted as dead. The ordinary centers of habitation were closed to him. He was banished to a spot far beyond the city, from whence he could return at times to submit himself to examination by the priests. If found to be cured, he was called upon to make recompense to God as a sinner before he regained his rights, and this because the basis of the disease was thought to be moral. No more terrible cry has ever been uttered than that made by the leper to warn humans of his approach unclean. Unclean. Only the Son of Man and certain of his saintly followers withstood the terror conveyed by such a sound during times when the disease was unconquerable. The early church, acting upon her founder's example, made special provisions for the treatment of lepers. For a time they were still debarred from entering places of worship, but gradually the law was relaxed on condition they remained in their own diocese. The next advance was a decision to maintain them out of church funds, while they were soon allowed to reside in certain parts of the cities. Although, in the first place, it was a tropical disease, leprosy became very common in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Thousands of lazar houses were built to accommodate the victims, who were provided with clothes, food, and a bell or clapper to give warning of their presence. Another signal proof of the care given to lepers in imitation of our Lord occurred in Syria during the early part of the 12th century. This was the founding of the Order of the Knights of St. Lazarus, the members of which spent their lives in serving the leper hospitals. By the beginning of the 17th century, the disease had practically lost its hold upon Europe, so that it came to be remembered here only as a thing of the past. But in other parts of the world, such as India, Africa, China, the Sudan, and the South Sea Islands, it remains a continual menace. Moreover, the modern form is in every way more terrible than the old. It is true that since the time of Father Damien a cure has been discovered, but the natives, who are always the chief victims, sometimes defer treatment until it is too late. A severe case usually proves fatal at the end of a year, although, as will be shown by the heroic subject of these pages, the disease may be extended over the period of a short lifetime. The various signs and stages of leprosy defy description. But by reason of their very horror, one fact clearly emerges, namely, that unless Jesus Christ, the friend and savior of lepers, is in a real sense with his followers, that unless his inspiration still guides them to fulfill his precept of boundless charity, then it is impossible to account for the manner in which something worse than death has been faced in order to tend the lepers. Perhaps the most convincing evidence of this is the fact that St. Francis of Assisi, that well-nigh perfect disciple, experienced a loathing at the sight of leprosy. Knowing this to be a weakness, he overcame it by a supreme effort, and by so doing marked a fresh advance in his attainment of sanctity. There is no proof as to how the disease first reached the Pacific Islands. Once there, however, the conditions of native life acted as a most favorable medium for its spreading. The islanders are of a naturally social character, and were then totally ignorant of the everyday safeguards against infection. For instance, any chance acquaintance who crossed their threshold was treated as an intimate friend. There was no denial of anything likely to serve as comfort or convenience. One dish was used for meals, one pipe for smoking, one mat for sleeping purposes. It was a state of hospitality carried to excess, in which the sick and healthy went so far as to exchange garments without thought or fear. The result was that leprosy soon increased. Every corner of the islands was swept by the pestilence, which, although filling them with despair, failed to inspire any effort among the easygoing Hawaiians that might have led to its prevention. They practically resigned themselves to the scourge and continued their old indiscriminate mode of living. There was no difference between the treatment of sick and sound. At last, in 1865, the Hawaiian government took its first step towards staying the progress of the plague. It was then somewhat late to commence, which lent an air of sudden severity to its action. For it was decided that every person infected with leprosy should be isolated upon the north coast of the island of Molokai. The order stated, in the cold language of official Dom, all lepers are required to report themselves to the government health office within 14 days from this date for inspection and final banishment to Molokai. This did not mean that they would continue to live there under as normal conditions as their state permitted, for the transportations were to be effected without additional cost to the government. Not even huts would be provided, while there was no thought of summoning medical aid. The way to Molokai was simply the passage to a slow death in surroundings so miserable and desolate as to be utterly inhuman. And so a new terror was added to the dismal lot of the stricken natives. It meant that homes would be wrecked and families broken up forever. The easily familiar character of the Hawaiians has already been mentioned, and in view of this, the decree promised to send hundreds to a fate that was more dreaded than the actual disease. Many lepers complied with the order, knowing their state to be a menace to the community. But others were not so easily parted from their relatives. Rather than suffer banishment, they went into hiding. Had better a refuge in the forest or on the mountainside than lifelong separation from all that stood for home. And by these means the order was more or less evaded. Such was the state of things until 1873, when a new king came to the throne. Sterner measures were then set afoot to isolate the afflicted, and a series of leper hunts were organized throughout the archipelago. Neither sex, age, or condition was taken into account, and among those banished was the queen's cousin. The hiding places were discovered, and still more lepers were hurried to the port of embarkation and shipped to Molokai. At the last moment, numbers of healthy Hawaiians would beg for the privilege of following their friends or relatives into exile. But the order of banishment applied only to the sick, so that final partings were made and the enforced separations continued. Such a scene as the following, described by an eyewitness, had become quite common to Father Damien during his work on the island. It refers to the transportation of lepers from the esplanade of Honolulu, the miserable beings, with a dazed look of lingering death in their fearful countenances, were soon disposed on the deck of a small outward-bound craft, and then, in the few moments that intervened between the casting off of the shoreline and the sudden impulse of the little steamer, as she swung about in midstream, a pitiful wail of men, women, and children was renewed. Those grouped upon the extreme edge of the wharf were wringing their hands over the water, while rivers of tears coursed down their ashen cheeks. The others, upon the deck of the departing vessel, brooded for a time as in dull agony, but anon an unearthly cry rang over the tranquil sea. It was their long farewell. As the plague increased and still more people were sent into exile, Damien reflected upon the miserable state of the lepers. What was in store for them along the grey coast of Molokai? So much was certain: they lived in total disregard of religion and died, unrepentant, without the sacraments. Some of the people he watched depart had belonged to his own parish, and for these he naturally felt a special anxiety. They had been rescued from paganism only to be launched into a still more dreadful future. For there was no one to keep the faith alive in the island Lazaretto, where despair and the ravages of disease would be added to the state of godlessness. It was impossible for the soul of Damien, overflowing with charity, to contemplate the lot of the poor natives without a feeling of horror. And so in his steady, determined way, he resolved to serve them as priest and helper whenever time and chance permitted. As once he had made up his mind to enter the church, so now he saw himself as the bringer of hope and consolation to the tortured beings on Molokai. There was no sign as to how such an opportunity might occur. He was bound to his own heavily encumbered parish, under the orders of his bishop, but by constant praying he could place himself at the disposal of God's will. If his desire was a reflection of divine providence, the way would become clear sooner or later. And so he waited, carrying out what were destined to prove his last duties in the district of Kohala. For his resolution had carried him to the threshold of martyrdom. His proffered sacrifice was acceptable to God, who had found in Damien an instrument for the manifestation of his glory to the outcast. The chance arrived in May 1873. Another missioner, Father Leonard, had completed a new church at Wailuku in the island of Maui. This was about to be dedicated by the Bishop of Honolulu, at which ceremony Damien was asked to be present. On arriving, he encountered some other members of the Society of the Sacred Hearts who had come to assist the mission. After the dedication, Monsignor Maigret, the bishop, addressed his clergy. His talk turned upon the sad spectacle of Molokai. Now and again, he stated, a priest had been sent there to hear confessions and administer the last sacraments. But 88 the new measures introduced by the government were likely to cut short these occasional visits, while scarcity of numbers made it impossible to appoint a priest for regular service on the doomed island. These words reminded the gathered clerics of a state of corruption for which, apparently, nothing could be done. A shadow seemed to pass over them as they reflected upon their native charges, separated only by a sheet of water, yet immeasurably remote in spirit. But to the listening Damien, they struck home with the significance of an answered prayer. He was never known to hesitate, and now he came forward, with his usual simple directness, and offered to accept the earthly burden of martyrdom. Monsignor, he said, here are your new missioners. One of them could take my district, and if you will be kind enough to allow it, I will go to Molokai and labor for the poor lepers, whose wretched state of bodily and spiritual misfortune has often made my heart bleed within me. Those who heard these words coming from the young priest's lips were fully conscious of all that lay behind them. Months, perhaps years, of certain agony, spent in the grip of one of the most loathsome diseases ever known to man, life under unimaginable conditions, a constant wrestling with deep-rooted evils. Even in the annals of the Catholic Church, where acts of devotion and heroism are more common than elsewhere in the human story, it was a most complete sacrifice. For a moment the bishop was amazed by the bold suggestion. But having some understanding of Damien's character, he knew it was not spoken in mere rashness. Then, gazing at the eager face, he saw reflected in the priest's eyes that light of serene, confident assurance which betokens the personal guidance of God. Recognizing this, the bishop could not refuse. He therefore consented, and so blazoned a new record in the book of immortal deeds enacted for the faith. Damien's hour had come. This was the mystic purpose underlying the sense of his vocation. All the important decisions of Damien's life, once they had been confirmed, were put into practice with great rapidity. Even in this, he asked for permission to leave at once for Molokai. The bishop agreed, and after a hasty farewell to the other missioners, they left the gathering and embarked for Honolulu. A batch of 50 lepers were to be shipped to the outcast settlement that very evening, and Damien intended to join them. Monsignor Maigret was to accompany him to his new post and explain the reason of his coming to the lepers. They reached Honolulu only half an hour before the vessel was timed to leave harbor. This left Damien without the time to say a single farewell to the members of his parish or collect his few belongings. He boarded the boat quite empty-handed, without so much as a change of linen. Even in the matter of possessing nothing, he was the true disciple, setting out in defiance of earthly wisdom to accomplish an insuperable task and without resources. Damien and his bishop attracted no attention on the boat, which was soon filled with the dismal cries of the lepers as the moment of departure drew near. They leaned over the rail, taking a last look at the friends and relatives they were leaving behind on shore, a cargo of human misery. While beyond them the sun scattered a golden radiance across the waves that marked the trail of desolation. The steamer cast off, and as it did so the sounds of anguish increased. Now the scarlet of sunset paved the waters towards the horizon, and soon darkness descended, blotting out the shore and the receding vessel of tragedy. A number of cattle were also being carried to Molokai, and throughout the dense tropical night their cries mingled with the utterances of human woe. But unknown to its victims, the seal of God had already been set upon the voyage and was lighting an invisible passage through the dark waters. At last they touched the coast of Molokai. And there, grouped about the landing stage for a sight of the new arrivals, were ragged, unkempt specimens of Damien's future community. To these the bishop spoke, "So far, my children, you have been left alone and uncared for, but you shall be so no longer. Behold, I have brought you one who will be a father to you, and who loves you so much that for your welfare and for the sake of your immortal souls, he does not hesitate to become one of you, to live and die with you." Then he raised his hand in benediction over the lepers. An hour later, having said goodbye to Damien, he boarded the boat and returned to Honolulu. And so the young priest, for Damien was then 33, entered upon the terrible life of the doomed island. He was friendless, unsheltered, and without a single possession or any prospect of help. But within him surged the knowledge that, whatever the future might bring, he was about to fulfill the last meaning of the divine call which had summoned him, in early youth, to the service of God. This was the purpose of his dedication, that he might walk, in imitation of his master, the forsaken road that ends in a blaze of glory. He had renounced the natural claims of existence to spend his young, vigorous manhood striving, in the solitary darkness, to recover that which was lost. It may be that, looking upon his future charges for the first time, he was aware of a quick feeling of repulsion, almost dread. For the success of his mission demanded that he must never cease to recognize in those maimed, shrinking, abandoned forms the likeness of Jesus Christ. While to live thus called for a wealth of charity that was scarcely of this earth. And the end of his sublime effort? Nothing but death, certain, relentless, accompanied by indescribable horrors. But the thoughts of Damien in the first great hour of his loneliness are closed against our lesser understanding. Let it suffice that somewhere upon the bleak stretch of inhuman desolation, which was to be the last scene of his labor, he looked to find a crown of life. Molokai, the smallest of the Hawaiian islands, it is about 30 miles by 7, was well fitted by nature to become a sheltering refuge. Towering rocks, rising sheer from the sea, gave it the name of the Isle of Precipices. These ascend gradually from the south side until in the north they reach a height of 2,000 or 3,000 feet. At the base of this steep promontory, both sides of which meet the sea, is a flat peninsula, only connected by little narrow paths. And it was upon this plain, some 3 miles inland, that the 2 leper settlements, Kalawao and Kalaupapa, were established. The high gray cliffs ward off the sun, which only sometimes splinters a golden lance through their broken summits. Far below, the inrush of the sea flings up a mist of foam. Birds haunt the slopes and crannies, while the less perpendicular heights are clothed in rank vegetation. Few trees and flowers, apart from the yellow hibiscus, wild ginger, convolvulus, white poppy, and orange blossom, grow on Molokai. The earth is mostly of hard volcanic substance, while rocks of lava abound. But even more decisive than these natural barriers, which seemed to cut the island off from outer communication, was the problem of the deadly disease that reigned unchecked behind them. We can only form a just appreciation of Father Damien's accomplishment by glancing at the state of affairs he encountered on leprous Molokai. Moreover, it must be borne in mind that he labored there as a priest, which fact naturally enlarged his personal responsibility. While his endurance was stretched to the utmost limit, he had to reform, teach, purify, in short, establish a deep sense of the eternal values where hitherto none had existed. It was his task to declare the principles of a merciful God in a wilderness of sorrow. Normally speaking, he had embarked upon the impossible. The original inhabitants of Molokai had abandoned their dwellings on the north coast, and these served to house the lepers. At best, they were a mere shelter against the weather, being formed of branches and thatched with leaves or grass. There were no foundations, and since they were level with the ground, the interiors, during rainy seasons, were flooded. Within these foul enclosures, the lepers crawled and huddled together. A few rags covered their tortured limbs, which, being leprous, were more than usually susceptible to cold. But those who claimed the shelter of the miserable huts were more fortunate than some, who, as numbers increased, were unable to find room. These took scanty cover under the walls that remained of the old native settlement, and dragged out the remainder of their doomed existences in the open. It is easy to understand how, under these conditions, the name of Molokai became synonymous with iniquity. Law and order belonged to the past. They were no longer obliged to work, while religion had totally disappeared from their blemished horizons. They were in the grip of a terrible malady, homeless, unclothed, and without the ordinary necessities of life. Hence they turned to the delusive relief of vice, and so increased the pall of misery under which they lived. One of the worst evils with which Damien had to grapple was drunkenness, for the natives manufactured an intoxicating liquor from the root of the ki plant, so that life in the squalid shelters was spent between drinking, card-playing, dancing, and fighting among themselves. This distilling of liquor was also illegal, and the sense of cheating the government added an air of criminality to their degradation. The moral and physical states of life on Molokai were therefore reduced to the very lowest level. It was, of course, the feeling of utter despair that generated the worst effects. For the victims of leprosy were cut off from every assistance, which fact in great part was responsible for their abandoned attitude. The most extreme cases were brought so near to animal existence that they crawled on all fours, resigned body and soul to the horrors that reigned on the island without check. Under these appalling conditions, the disease gained in virulence, so that deaths occurred at the average of one a day. During the 8 years prior to Damien's arrival, some 2,000 lepers had been shipped to the settlements, and of this number about half were surviving at the time of his ministry. It might be reckoned that a quarter of these were Catholics. Since a doctor was unknown at Molokai, there was no hospital to receive the dying lepers. These were carried into a rough shelter, usually a accompanied by a ready coffin, and afterwards buried in a mere hole raked a little below the surface of the ground, which their weakened fellow sufferers could scarcely turn. There was no respect for the dead on Molokai, for when life loses its savor, only the physical significance of death remains. In seeking to understand the life work of Father Damien, it is necessary to be reminded, even in this fragmentary manner, of the bestial aspects of his everyday surroundings. And now that the knowledge of his martyrdom has passed into the world's keeping, one may be tempted to think of him in the more general term of heroism. Again, he was so intensely practical that it is even possible for the skeptic to laud his actions while neglecting their source of inspiration. But Damien must be visualized as pursuing his silent, isolated way, remote from the world, in the face of dangers that menace the morale, the physique, and what are perhaps more vital, the nerves of man. The swift, sudden response that may sometimes depend upon a fitful glow of reckless enthusiasm was not demanded of him. He was asked to endure greatly, and with the certain knowledge that relief would never be forthcoming. And his endurance would be crowned only when he had become an object of repulsive fear to man. He must learn to apply the terrible word clean to the strong, fresh vigor of his maturity. But the secret of Father Damien will never be found in the skeptical explanation that views him apart from the cradle of his sacrifice, which was mystical membership in the body of Christ. Damien, the apostle of the lepers, the friend of the outcast, was in the first place Damien the Dryast. He was bound to the service of stricken humanity by reason of his dedication to the service of God. He reached desolate man through the act of glorifying God at the altar. His life was molded by the essential paradox which is divine truth, without which he would never have set foot upon the tainted earth of Molokai. Some time after Damien's reforms were in working order, the writer Robert Louis Stevenson visited the island. Even then, when, it needs to be emphasized, conditions were much improved, he wrote of his experiences there in such sentences as the following: "Life in the lazaretto is an ordeal from which the nerves of a man's spirit shrink, even as his eye quails under the light of the sun. A pitiful place to visit and a hell to dwell in. I am not a man more than usually timid, but I never. Recall the days and nights I spent upon that island promontory, 8 days and 7 nights without felt thankfulness that I am somewhere else. As for the leper inhabitants, they were described by Stevenson as gorgons and chimeras, dire pantomime deformations of our common manhood. Such a population as only now and again surrounds us in the horrors of a nightmare. What, then, must Father Damien have encountered during years of residence, and before he had shaped his terrible material into the vestige of ordinary humanity that could yet inspire Stevenson with so much horror? Such a comparison only points to the fact that Damien wrestled with the indescribable and achieved the impossible, for he was one of that high fellowship of the faith who may overcome all things. The only sign of religion on the living graveyard, as Molokai was called, was a wooden oratory dedicated to Saint Philomena. It had been served by the priest who, on the rare occasions that offered, managed to visit the lepers. But these calls were too long divided to exert more than a temporary influence, so that Damien had literally to awaken, rather than restore, the sense of God in their midst. Humanly speaking, there was nothing to turn the lepers from their old manner of living. It is true that Damien's presence could be counted upon to inspire a forgotten confidence among them. His example was a living witness to trust in their kind, when animated by the charity of divine assurance. But the thought of causing their lives to be governed according to Catholic principles promised almost the same difficulty as rousing a blind man to an appreciation of natural beauty. Their receptive power was closed to every fine impression, while the suffering of an abandoned fate had steeled their hearts against remorse and the prospect of ultimate hope. Damien was well aware of the tragic blackness of his future environment. "Now, Joseph, this is your life's work," he had said on landing at Molokai. And so he proceeded inland to wage his struggle for souls against difficulties that were a challenge to his boundless faith. He was conducted to the settlement of Kalawao, which was to be his home. This necessitated a 3-mile walk over the rocky interior, after which he was faced with the problem of finding some immediate accommodation. The only available shelters were the leper huts, the miserable state of which has already been mentioned, and even Damien did not feel equal to sampling their foulness. He left the dwellings and made his way through the falling night to seek a refuge in the open. His choice lighted upon a large pandanus tree, which spread its branches over the native churchyard. Homeless, and without a single personal belonging, he entered upon his ordeal in the destitute condition which, whilst appalling the world, has proved the means of sanctified accomplishment to many a saint. And there, after the manner of Catholic knighthood, he kept his vigil. But in place of the proud armor hung the sombre folds of his cassock, while instead of the glistening sword a wooden crucifix was clasped as the pledge of a binding service. Neither did the moonlight carry the hued reflection of any rose-lit window. It flickered through the darkly burdened branches, wavering in fitful gleams from the dim background of star-illumined sky. There he knelt through the still hours of that tropical night, overshadowed by the great tree that was to prove his only shelter for many a week to come. We are ignorant of the prayer with which he prefaced his acceptance of martyrdom. His time of preparation passed in a silence that no thought can measure. He was not, like his master, upon a somewhat kindred occasion, even within the reach of friends who slumbered. Yet it may be that God walked anew in his afflicted garden, this time not with the earliest, but one of the bravest of men. The care of his lepers came first, so that Damien was unable to build himself a hut for some time. He was exposed to every change of weather and could have slept but little at nights, when darkness increased the horrors by which he was surrounded. But there was no thought of withdrawing from his chosen apostolate, which commenced with the moment of the first sunrise he saw over Molokai. Previous to this, the chances that he would ever again return to Belgium had been infinitely remote. But now he knew that by his own election such a prospect had been finally resigned. A voluntary barrier stood between him and the little lowland farmhouse, a barrier that marked him off from the rest of men as a source of repulsion to all he might encounter. For, as was said of him later, death was not the danger to be dreaded there. Terror was the loathsome disease. To some men, death on the battlefield would seem nothing to shrink from. But death from the most loathsome malady imagination can conceive, or observation describe death as the result of long protracted corruption and decay calls for the spirit of a martyr to volunteer for a death like that. It was precisely this contact with the horror and miseries of the island that, to Damien's spiritual insight, appeared the fruition of the divine summons which had come to him in youth. To quote his own words, by special providence of our divine Lord, who during his public life showed a particular sympathy for lepers, my way was traced towards Kalawao in May 1873. I was then 33 years of age, enjoying a robust good health. I have sometimes thought that Damien intended this last phrase to act as a challenge upon the indifference of the ease-loving world. For his reference to a perfect bodily state suggests a vital contrast to the condition that must result from a period of life on the island. I was then 33 years of age, enjoying a robust good health, a man conscious of strength, and at a time of life that might well have been colored by the first flush of realized ambition. It is far from my purpose to imply that any connection exists between the inward glow of spiritual and that which comes of personal accomplishment. That which I imagined Damien to have felt was, of course, the effect of a new triumph by virtue of renunciation in the name of the living God. But a certain silence, in which the pride of a possessed faith seems one with our own, may invest his words with the partial hint that attaches to an earlier declaration, "All day I sat in your temple teaching, and you took me not." Writing to Father Pamphile, Damien said, "God has deigned to choose your unworthy brother to assist the poor people attacked by that terrible malady so often mentioned in the Gospel, leprosy." And later on, as though to deny the possibility of illusion, he uttered these words, "I make myself a leper among the lepers to gain all for Jesus Christ." He looked for no escape from the inevitable burden of Molokai. His was not the attitude that spreads an account of good works open before God, with the repeated question, "Why should I suffer?" Soon, when preaching, he was to exchange the customary form of address, "My 66 brethren," for we lepers, for he knew that human wretchedness may be consecrated and reconciled to God only when the mediator, like those he seeks to rescue, has sounded the depths of tragedy. The basis of all true Catholic enthusiasm is common sense, while stating that fidelity to the Church, as being the mouthpiece of God, is the first and great necessity. It makes no impossible or exaggerated demands concerning the exercise of religion. And this fact was one of the most prominent in the life of Father Damien. His object was the salvation of the lepers isolated on Molokai, without hope and without God. Their abandonment was the natural fruit of despair, which in turn was chiefly caused by distressful conditions. He started, therefore, from the point of realizing that the root of evil was the social state. The truths of divine revelation could not find acceptance among the lepers until their everyday life had been reformed. It is a common practice to misuse the word reformer by associating it with innovations. All genuine reforms mark the restoration of a primal significance, and in this sense Father Damien was a great reformer. His task was to cleanse the lazaretto of all existing abuses, and so prepare a way for the proclamation of his message. The code of life that had come to prevail on Molokai was contained in the saying, "In this place there is no law." When Damien arrived, this had been firmly adopted by the older inhabitants, who spread it among the batches of newcomers. He was stirred to resentment by this infamous doctrine, which he determined to overcome and in its place establish a law unchanging and eternal. It might be thought that his intended reforms required a concentrated body of labor and its extension over a number of years. But Damien was a solitary worker, while under the most favorable circumstances, his time of activity was bound to be limited. Yet the knowledge of having been directed to this path filled him with assurance. Moreover, his personal abilities denoted a special fitness for the institution of practical reforms. He was capable of imparting the inspiration he experienced to others. Although not officious, it was seldom that one came in contact with his influence without sensing a stir of latent qualities. Every individual who accepted his guidance became a public example of the efficacy of faith. Lost strength was renewed, and failing courage revived. He encountered iniquity as men fight a physical force, and overcame it as such. And while not a declared mystic, his positive source of power was mystic communion with the unseen. This chapter, of necessity, will be less concerned with Father Damien the priest than Joseph de Veuster, peasant and workman, whose toil-hardened hands would be turned to such good account as a prelude to propagating the essential truths of God. But as he intended it, his practical ministry was a stepping stone between oblivion and resurrection. He approached spiritual reality by means of a material conquest. One of his earliest needs was to settle in a permanent home, from whence his activities could be directed. He did not commence this until he had been on the island for some weeks. Then, with the aid of subscriptions that arrived from Honolulu, he built himself a hut. This was 16 feet long and 10 feet wide, and gave good proof of his skill in carpentry. The bodily discomfort of the lepers was partly due to an inadequate water supply. Before they could wash or cleanse their rags, they had to walk some distance to obtain the water, and then carry it back. This they were but little inclined, or sometimes unable, to do. so that the most unwholesome physical conditions prevailed among them. Damien gave this matter his immediate attention. By making inquiries, he learned that a natural spring existed in the valley of Waihano. He set out to investigate, accompanied by guides, and discovered a supply of fresh water, which never dried up, at the foot of a precipice. His next step was to make application to the Hawaiian government for a number of water pipes. When these arrived, he chose a working party from among the more able lepers, and under his leadership the pipes were soon laid down. Thus the leper settlements were first given a constant supply of pure water, which naturally reacted upon the general state of health. Some years later, when official interest had been finally aroused by Damien's heroism, it was this original aqueduct that underwent improvement. But before bathing and washing passed into common usage among the lepers, Damien did not shrink from applying towel and water to the diseased bodies with his own hands. Then, having introduced the habit of cleanliness, he turned to another urgent need, that of dwellings. Reference has already been made to the miserable erections that served to shelter the lepers. That they had not attempted to improve them is no matter for astonishment, as naturally carefree and diffident of application, their present state had made them resigned and lethargic. Even when, soon after Damien's landing, the violent Kona or south wind broke over the island and wrought such havoc among the shelters that many of the sick were left with no more than a mat. They felt no urge to undertake reconstruction. It was left for Damien to set an example by starting the work single-handed. Neither did he follow the old model, for he again approached the government with a request for wooden framework, boards, and other building necessities. In time, the stronger lepers came to his assistance, and soon the inspiration of an active presence had summoned all capable men into the round of labor. Rows of strong cottages, raised on trestles in order to escape the after-effects of storms, sprang into existence. Within 2 years of commencing, 300 similar shelters had been erected, so that well-planned and secure villages, revealing a variety of whitewashed or painted fronts, came to provide further evidence of Damien's work on Molokai. Apart from increasing the comfort of the lepers, these cottages improved the standard of life, and so helped to check the carrying of infection. First the water supply, then housing arrangements, had been incalculably bettered by Damien's coming. And his next contribution to the struggle against disease and despair was concerned with the problem of food. The government, on reserving Molokai for the lepers, imagined they would come to form a self-supporting colony. With this in view, they had dispatched there some horses, heifers, and farming implements, which quite failed to advantage the exiles. When this scheme had finally collapsed, a sailing ship was sent with food to the island. But besides being small and badly provisioned, it only called at irregular intervals, while it was sometimes prevented from putting in by a rough sea. The supply was always far below need, even as regards the sheer necessities of life. For instance, Damien found that most of his charges had been without fresh milk for years. So once more he petitioned the government, asking that more provisions might be sent, and at regular times. Before long this regularity was observed, but his continued requests make it plain that the quality and quantity of the supplies were not also improved. Yet he still persisted, although it was only towards the end of his ministry that a real system of provisioning was established. By this, every person received a weekly allowance of meat, milk, biscuits, and poai, which is a favorite native food made from the root of the taro vegetable. He also persuaded the able-bodied men to cultivate plots of ground, where crops of taro and sweet potato were raised. Still more remarkable was the reawakening of their dormant sense of beauty, so that they took pride in the making of flower gardens. Under his careful supervision, all manner of work increased, and with it went an elevated outlook on life. For it is a commonplace of spiritual endeavor that ethical and utilitarian values are interchangeable. Following these reforms, Damien applied himself to the matter of clothing. Hitherto only a few garments had reached the lepers every year, and then at the same irregular intervals as the food supply. For the most part they were in rags, so that their complaint was aggravated by exposure. Damien resolved to remedy this, and set about collecting the necessary goods to open a store in each of the villages. When this was done, he persuaded the government to grant the lepers an annual allowance of $6. This enabled them to purchase their own garments, which, apart from the actual benefit of being properly clothed, restored a sense of dignity among them. Every improvement marked a furtherance of Damien's plan, which was the revival of human conditions in a world of outcasts. The most appalling spot on Molokai was the building that went by the name of Hospital. No nurse or doctor had ever been seen there, while medicine and even bandages were unknown. The few native remedies in use were seldom applied, as dying lepers were simply carried into the building, which was a mere shed, and placed on the floor to die. And their coffins, when such were available, usually accompanied them on the same cart, as once having entered, there was no leaving the charnel house alive. Damien encountered indescribable horrors in striving to alleviate the last days of his charges, but, as in every other respect, he was eminently successful. It was some time before the lepers could forget the old dreadful associations of the word hospital. However, under his influence, a regular dispensary came to be fitted up and attended by a resident doctor. This, of course, was long after his landing, yet he was able to die in the knowledge that one of the greatest evils attending leprosy on the island had been finally he also undertook to bury the victims who, before human conditions returned, were barely flung into the ground. For this purpose he measured off and enclosed a cemetery, in which he acted as grave digger, and if time permitted, even as coffin maker. But altogether he manufactured about 1,000 coffins, otherwise the dead were buried in their clothes or wrapped in a blanket. The cost of a decent burial was about $2, and to bring this within reach of every leper he formed what he called a coffin association, which was maintained by a small regular subscription. There was nothing dismal in this provision, as those taking advantage of it were Catholics who understood the true meaning of death. For while Damien imparted a natural respect for the dead, he emphasized, in the name of the Church and her founder, the passing incompleteness of material existence. His sympathy was stirred by the number of leper children who wandered, utterly uncared for, over the island. While mixing with these, he formed the ambition of building orphanages and schools, and by 1880 the plan had matured. He founded 2 homes, one for boys, where they were trained in suitable tasks, and the other for girls, where needlework and similar household duties were taught. In the case of children who still lived with their parents, he arranged classes in the open air. Thus, to the calling of priest was now added that of teacher, while to perpetuate these reforms he had to act as parent to many of his orphan pupils. On his outdoor activities, he was invariably surrounded by children, in whose eyes Father Damien personified the sole meaning of friend. As life improved, he was able to gather helpers for the erection of churches, although for the most part the work was always his own. Each of the settlements soon had its own church, the exteriors of which were brightly colored in order to please the vivid sense of the natives. This strenuous labor was accepted as a matter of course by Damien, who was able to say in December 1874, "These 10 years I have been on the mission. I have built a church or chapel every year." But apart from these actual achievements, he was always busy in putting down the existing abuses. Of these, drunkenness cost him many a bitter effort to stamp out. The distillers of Key, as the liquor was called after the root it was obtained from, indulged it as a means of finding oblivion from their calamity. Moreover, it reduced them to the necessary low level of drunkards, by which their own vices appear to be justified. It led to the worst excesses of heathenism, while some of the police were known to be sharers in these unlawful distilleries. Damien's task was therefore doubly difficult, apart from the normal dislike that always attaches to the efforts for overcoming vice. He was bound to become unpopular in certain quarters. Nevertheless, by dint of threats or persuasion, as the case demanded, he gained the victory. Sometimes the articles used in distillation were given up, while the more hardened wrongdoers were only cured by being made subject to law. Many of these were pardoned after giving an assurance not to offend again. But whatever the result, Father Damien called into being a measure of hatred and opposition. True, this was only among the totally abandoned culprits, who, sound or leprous, would have recoiled from his influence in favor of their own ways. Lepers of ordinary virtue were firmly attached to Father Damien. He was Catholic, a priest, and a reformer of evil, 3 capital points for a determined enemy to work on. Many difficulties were also set in the way of his spiritual functioning. For instance, after he had been on Molokai for some weeks, he paid a return visit to Honolulu in order to find a priest to whom he could go for confession. Whilst there he called on the president of the Board of Health, whose attitude towards Damien was far from friendly. The official, in fact, seemed rather surprised by when the subject of Damien's return to Molokai was broached. The president informed him that in future he must remain there for good. So far as this affected his own fate, Damien cared little. But he was under the necessity of seeing his bishop from time to time, and since the ban threatened to interfere with duty, he requested that the exception usually made in the cases of priests and physicians should be applied to him. This, he was told, would not be possible under the now stringent rules of isolation. Once he returned to Molokai, he must never venture to set foot on another part of the islands. Damien left the Board of Health without promising to observe this restriction. But on going back to the leper settlements, he received an official warning to the effect that, should he ever try to make another visit, he would be arrested. Damien knew that this attack upon privilege would inevitably reflect upon the spiritual state of his lepers, and his reply was simple, and to the point: I shall come. You must not prevent me from visiting my bishop. In the meantime, before any issue resulted, the bishop made his visitation of the island missions. He traveled by steamer, and on nearing Molokai asked the captain to put him ashore. Monsignor Maigret's intention was to give Damien the chance of making his confession. But the captain refused to touch land, as such a proceeding was contrary to the government's order. Failing this, the bishop induced the captain to anchor within easy reach of the shore, from whence signals were made for Damien to approach. This he did, putting out in a boat that was rowed by lepers, and coming to rest at a given distance from the steamer. The passengers, who were curious spectators of the scene that followed, lined the rail, dividing their attention between the bishop in the foreground and the priest who remained standing in the boat. Monsignor Maigret then asked whether any of the passengers spoke French. He was answered in the negative, and following this assurance, Father Damien made his confession under the casual gaze of onlookers and separated from his confessor by a strip of water. In conclusion, the bishop, leaning over the side, spoke the words of divine pardon. This great act of humility on Damien's part will scarcely be understood by anyone who is a stranger to the sacrament of penance. Whether or not the passengers on the steamer were wholly ignorant of French is a moot point. In any case, Damien's attitude of self-abasement was so complete as to be perfectly evident to the public. His position was not less eloquent than the medium of words. And surely the power that was conveyed by the divine utterance, whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven, and whose sins you shall retain, they are retained, has never been exercised under circumstances more strange than these. Before long, the French consul, who had interested himself on Damien's behalf, was able to inform him that the Board of Health's restrictions had been somewhat modified, which left him free to carry on his work without hindrance. And that work came to include every species of activity that made up life on Molokai. Apart from the duties of priesthood, there was the management of the many institutions he had founded. After early Mass, he visited the schools and orphanages, where he gave instruction. There were always numerous sick in need of the sacraments, children and converts to be baptized, and, moreover, marriages to be performed. For the lepers, in spite of their certain doom, continued to marry. And whenever the rigors of isolation came to be enforced, Damien was careful to see that couples, so far as possible, were never separated. But the greater part of his daily round was spent in the hospital. There he administered the last rites to the dying and superintended the division of every comfort. Sometimes a special delicacy would arrive from the sisters in Honolulu, and the totally helpless victims would be helped to this by Damien with his own hands. His way among the lepers marked an endless ministry to broken bodies and stricken souls. Such was the unchanging order of his life for 16 weary years. The triumph of his resistance was literally a triumph of faith. Before this, horror alone had reigned, and to the exclusion of all natural hope on the island. But in Damien, the lepers found a man who could indicate the promises of God beyond the pathetic signs of human despair. And profiting by his words, and the inspiration that was manifest in all his actions, they discovered the meaning of a joy that overcomes sorrow, of a supernatural assurance that outweighs all mortal certainty. So it was that a hitherto lawless community accepted a peaceful government, that contentment replaced degradation and vice, and that paganism and idolatry gave way to a knowledge of God. Because of these things, a visitor to Molokai could, in time, observe the faces one sees are nearly always happy faces, and this tremendous contrast was wholly due to the life work of Father Damien. He offered himself as an example to the lost, who, seeing that such a sacrifice could only be prompted by truth, took heart and followed his guidance to proclaim themselves the children of God. In explanation of his method, he could say, kindness to all, charity to the needy, a sympathizing hand to the sufferers and the dying, in conjunction with a solid religious training to my listeners. These have been my constant means to introduce moral habits among the lepers. I am happy to say that, assisted by the local administration, my labors here, which seemed to be almost in vain at the beginning, have, thanks to a kind providence, been greatly crowned with success. In January 1874, another priest, Father Andrew Bergerman, came to take over the part of Molokai that was not inhabited by lepers. This was done in order that Damien could devote himself exclusively to the afflicted. But with the newcomer's arrival, Damien exchanged parishes for a time while he built him a church on the southern side of the island. This cost over 5,000 francs, was 44 feet long and 22 feet wide, while it boasted 10 Gothic windows and a tower 50 feet high. On completing this, he returned to the leper settlements, and Father Andrew took charge of the southern quarter. The growth of Damien's influence was accompanied by a corresponding relaxation in the law that had previously excluded all reminders of the outer world from Molokai. One of the earliest signs of this was the cutting of a bridle path down the rocky steep that divided the settlements from the rest of the island. There was no question of the lepers taking advantage of this means of communication, as it promised a very stiff and drawn-out climb for the healthiest of men. But even this banished the sense of unbroken seclusion from the Grey Island. It proclaimed the coming of that genuine progress in humanity which, in the name of civilization, goes hand in hand with the faith. Damien was fully alive to the reality of the danger he was facing. He kept nothing from his brother, to whom he wrote leprosy, as far as is known, is incurable. It seems to begin by a corruption of the blood. Discolored patches appear on the skin, especially on the cheeks, and the parts affected lose their feeling. After a time, this discoloration covers the whole body. A description of the more revolting details was followed by the eloquent admission, "I have had great difficulty in getting accustomed to such an atmosphere." Take picture to yourself, he went on to say, a collection of huts with 800 lepers. No doctor, in fact, as there is no cure. There seems no place for a doctor's skill. A white man who is a leper, and your humble servant, do all the doctoring work. This letter was, of course, written some years before any tangible reforms had resulted from his efforts. They were of slow growth, for the soil of Molokai was scarcely less hard than the abandoned state to which the lepers had been reduced. But from the first hour of Damien's ministry, the Grey Island ceased to be a symbol of terror, for over its outcast inhabitants and squalid shelters was dawning the radiance of the cross of charity. The activities of Damien, the man we must now pass to the exercise of his priestly duties. For great and necessary as his material reforms were, it was a spiritual call that had led him to Molokai. Its prevailing miseries could be checked, and life there made easier, but his real work was to reconcile the lost souls of the islanders to God. On one hand, it is true that practical improvements were essential in order to soften the minds of the people. Without these, he would have experienced added difficulty in gaining sympathetic listeners. On the other hand, once these had been accepted, their proper order depended upon a realization of eternal values. This interchangeability has often been insisted upon, and must be remarked again here. For without God, no genuine or lasting reforms are possible. Every man-made innovation that seems to take lasting root is at the mercy of time and circumstance, while those things that we recognize today as being of God were known as such at the founding of Christianity. In this spirit, Damien made his plans for rescuing the lepers from degradation. He had shown organizing ability and enlisted government help in bettering the lot of the outcasts. But it was another and more difficult matter to rouse them to a sense of religious responsibility. Under normal conditions, this would have been hard enough, and Damien had indescribable horrors to overcome. Many a time, he said, in fulfilling my priestly duty at their domiciles, I have been compelled to run outside. One day at the Sunday Mass, I found myself so stifled that I thought I must leave the altar to breathe a little of the outer air. To counteract this, he made himself accustomed to the use of tobacco, and could say later, "Now my sense of smell does not cause me so much inconvenience, and I enter the huts of the lepers without difficulty." Sometimes, indeed, I still feel some repugnance when I have to hear the confessions of those near their end. Often also, I scarce know how to administer extreme unction. There is no need to pursue these repulsive details, which all go to prove that the virtue of charity, as revealed by Damien, could go no further. On Sundays and festivals, he would first of all celebrate Mass at Kalawao. Then he made a hurried journey to the other settlement of Kalaupapa, where he again said Mass and stayed for Vespers and Benediction. After this, he went back to Kalawao, where the two latter services would be repeated. The ceremonial of these churches was as regular as Damien's means and the generosity of friends permitted. A set of golden altar vessels had arrived from the superior of St. Roch in Paris, while the nuns at Honolulu contributed to the interior decorations. It is true that his servers frequently showed signs of the wasting disease, which by attacking the chest and throat also made the upkeep of the choir a continual problem. But given the necessary encouragement, Damien found that a great degree of fervor existed among his lepers. So long as the churches remained open, there was always someone praying before the Blessed Sacrament, showing, as he remarked, a zeal that would make some religious blush. He was able to say of the non-Catholics he encountered almost all end by seeing the truth, and this was borne out by the number of his conversions, which averaged about 100 yearly. By the end of 1873, he had completed another chapel, which, although costing 1,500 francs, left him only 25 francs in debt. "I have not a penny of income." He stated, "Yet nihil mihi diest," I want for nothing. I have even alms to give away. How is this to be explained? That is his secret, who promised to give 100-fold to those who gave up all for him. The vitality of Catholicism on the island was shown by the forming of a guild of perpetual adoration in 1879. This meant that the sick and dying were constantly united by their prayers to God, while intercession was also made for the world beyond their stricken enclosure. Thus the maimed were often to be seen praying for the clean, and the whole a commentary on the diverse outlooks of faith and unfaith. But perhaps the most touching scenes on Molokai were the processions of the Blessed Sacrament. A number of the more able-bodied lepers would lead the way, and after these came children with the customary baskets of flowers, strewing petals in the path of Damien, who followed bearing the host. Then would come a straggling procession of the faithful, lepers in every stage of the disease, some walking upright yet with wasted bodies, others bent, and many who had lost their limbs simply crawling over the ground. These acts of adoration were a source of great pleasure to the natives, who, once restored to contentment, were careful to observe every point of Damien's teaching. And he was always well attended, for in spite of the large number of deaths, nearly 200 occurred every year. New victims constantly arrived, so that the island population was never far short of 700 souls. Sometimes, when called to the dying, Damien would carry the Holy Viaticum publicly, as in Catholic countries. Various incidents, typical of the effects of his ministry, are scattered throughout his letters. For instance, we find him writing on December 1874, "One have just buried one of my best Christians, 66, the son of one who suffered persecution for the faith. His death was extremely edifying. Longing for heaven, he was constantly repeating the words of Saint Paul, I desire to be dissolved, and to be six with Christ. When I came with the Holy Viaticum to his bedside, his faith and love shone forth unmistakably on his countenance. He is buried under the shadow of the great cross I have erected in the middle of our new cemetery. With him lie nearly 200 other lepers, who have died Catholics this last year and a half." The same note occurs again at a later period. "Returning yesterday evening after an absence of 6 days, I found one of my children dying. She begged me to bring her the Holy Viaticum without delay. And scarce had she finished her thanksgiving when she gave up her soul to the God whom she had just received. Yesterday I made her coffin myself and dug her grave. This morning after the Requiem Mass I was apprised of the death of 2 more members of my flock, so today I have 3 burials." One day Damien was called to the bedside of a sick woman. She was well known to him as a determined Calvinist, who in the past had made light of his many efforts to convert her. And his practiced eye soon perceived that she was troubled not by any deadly symptom of leprosy, but a more she made signs to those about her of a wish to write, and Damien placed a paper and pencil in her hands. On reading the sentences she inscribed, he could scarcely believe his eyes, for they ran as follows: "I am not an evil spirit. I am the angel guardian of this woman. For 6 months I have been urging her to be converted. Now I am using this violent means. Tomorrow she will be herself again, and will be converted." True enough, he found that next day her old obstinacy had departed, so that she asked to receive baptism. Without explaining his reason, Damien showed the paper on which she had written while possessed of the spirit that was not her own. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. "No," came the answer. "Have you felt anything lately?" he went on. "For the last 6 months," the woman told him, "every night I have heard an interior voice telling me to become a Catholic. I have always resisted, but now I am conquered." She was instructed, baptized, and showed a fervor that edified all, was Damien's final comment. His round of life was full of varying experiences, both gratifying and disappointing. "Here is a little adventure which has just happened to me," he said once. "This evening, at 8 o'clock, I was summoned to a dying woman. The night being very dark, the road muddy, and the rain falling in spouts, I was obliged to take my horse. Alighting at my destination, I tethered my horse carefully before entering the place. There I found a number of Catholic women, all lepers. The dying woman, who had before apostatized, made a good confession and received extreme unction, while the company prayed aloud. On leaving the place there was no horse to be seen. He had snapped the cord and was off, carrying with him my good cloak which I had strapped over the saddle. It It was no use to hunt for him, so I had to tramp as I was over stones and ruts through mud and rain to my hut. Well, here I am again, safe and sound, regretting indeed the probable loss of my cloak, but full of joy at having helped to save a soul. Some of the lepers, before their isolation on Molokai, had fallen a prey to heretical teaching, which Damien did his best to stamp out. The errors were chiefly of Calvinistic origin, while even Mormon ideas had been imported. And the people who held them, by not coming under his influence, did not share fully in the reformed life of the island. On one occasion, a riot nearly broke out among them. The ringleaders urged that they were not receiving fair treatment from the government, and several of the younger lepers joined in the agitation. However, the sudden appearance of Father Damien put an end to the clamor. He uttered a few words of reproof, while they listened in silence and with bowed heads. His authority was so undeniable that such a scene was never again repeated. Moreover, he noted with a certain satisfaction that there were only 2 Catholics among the malcontents, thus showing that even those unaffected by his message could not withstand the rites of his missionary calling. The Catholic Church is the one lasting bond capable of uniting the men of all races and every conceivable worldly persuasion. It was this supernal link that alone saved Father Damien from absolute loneliness. For from 1873 to 1878, he was practically isolated among the lepers, who, apart from the differences produced by their fictional condition, were natives almost to a man. Yet the fellowship of the faith overcame all natural barriers and caused a measure of intimacy to exist between the white priest and his colored parishioners that otherwise could not have been observed. Letter writing, his sole means of communication with the outer world, came to be accepted as a rare luxury, for the stress of daily duties compelled him to snatch a few hours from sleep if he wished to keep in touch with friends and relatives. During the first 5 years of his ministry, he only received some occasional help from the priest who served the healthy quarter of the island. In 1878, Father André Nolander arrived, and his assistance was doubly valuable since, in earlier life, he had studied medicine. The length of Father André's stay on Molokai is uncertain, but in 1881 Damien was again working single-handed. His next helper was Father Albert Montitan. The last years, however, were brightened by the arrival of a regular staff comprising Fathers Conradi and Wendelin and 2 lay assistants, Brother James, a burly Irishman, and Brother Joseph, a recent convert to Catholicism who had previously held a commission in the American Army. Picture to yourself this little band of workers, drawn from different nationalities, spending their manhoods to alleviate the last days of diseased natives in the South Sea Islands. And there you have practical evidence of the one universal faith. Small as their sum total necessarily was on remote Molokai, yet indescribable differences came to be mingled in that mighty stream, which, left to the world, would still have remained in flagrant opposition. But as outposts of the papacy, they shared the consciousness of a common home. One of the most noticeable features of reform was the new feeling of reverence that was shown towards the dead. Hitherto their bodies had been callously disposed of, as the sense of the survivors had never penetrated beyond the material. But under Damien, they learned to regard the apparently worthless body in its true light, as the one-time home of an immortal spirit. Furthermore, with the realization of what is meant by the communion of saints, they ceased to look on death as a necessary evil. Instead of a lasting separation from all they had known, it promised complete union with the fountainhead of eternal being. And as faith was born and strengthened among the outcasts, their gray exile took on the hues of an almost radiant existence, while the bleak island upturned a hidden beauty to the passing of a transcendent breath. It must not be thought, however, that Damien was in any way removed from the natural trials of humanity. He was sometimes afflicted by that devastating loneliness which is of the spirit, such as drew the following confession from him: without the blessed sacrament a position like mine would not be tolerable. There was the secret of his strength, of his unyielding resistance. There, as he would often point out to the lepers who clustered about him in dumb desperation, was their one sure comfort and refuge against the ills of the world. "You suffer," he would say. "Take heart, for here in your midst is one who can turn your sorrow into joy. Go to him then, who dwells in the tabernacle. Go to him, and he will console you."